Allow me to share some background about my wife and me. I'm Shane, aged 45, and my wife is Carrie, aged 44. We've been married for 23 years and have a daughter named Casey, who is currently in her final semester of college. Casey has always brought immense joy into our lives and is pursuing a degree in education with the goal of becoming a math teacher. I grew up on a ranch in a small Texas town, where I worked diligently while still finding time for sports, rodeos, and socializing. Following high school, I pursued a college education in agriculture with aspirations of becoming a high school agricultural teacher. Given my parents' limited finances, I worked part-time to help support our family. During my last semester of college, my parents decided to retire and sold the ranch, opting for a modest home in town. Tragically, they were both eliminated in a car accident on their way back from my graduation. Being their only child, I inherited the proceeds from the sale, which amounted to around $400,000, a surprising revelation since they had never disclosed the exact amount to me. The following months were exceptionally challenging as I mourned the loss of my parents, particularly given the suddenness of their passing. However, I persevered through my grief and, in August, seized an opportunity to teach agricultural science at a high school just outside Austin. I also decided to utilize my inheritance to purchase a quaint 25-acre ranch on the outskirts of town. Here, I constructed a modern log cabin, a horse barn, and a training ring for the horses I planned to acquire, along with investing in some cattle. While I wasn't actively seeking a spouse, I was open to the idea of finding someone to share my life and dreams of starting a family. Approximately a month into the school year, I met Carrie through a setup arranged by my mentor teacher. Initially, I was hesitant, but I figured it was worth a shot, given my circumstances. When Carrie answered the door, I was immediately struck by her incredible beauty. Our first date, which included dinner and drinks, went smoothly, and I felt a strong connection with Carrie. As we conversed on her balcony later that evening, I couldn't help but wonder why such an exceptional woman was still single. Carrie echoed my sentiments, complimenting my attributes and expressing her attraction. Blushing, I admitted that I had never felt this way about anyone before, and that there was something truly special about her. Well, Shane, thank you. I can relate. Most of the men I've dated were either clueless or inappropriate. I've never encountered someone I wanted to seriously commit to until tonight. I turned to her, and as our eyes met, we shared a kiss. It wasn't an overly aggressive, messy French kiss, but a gentle, tender one. We lingered in that embrace for several minutes. Then I spoke up. Look, Carrie, I'd like to see you again. We don't have to rush into anything, but I'm interested in seeing where this goes. I want to truly understand you before we... Well, you know, Shane, you're one of the sweetest men I've ever met. You were a true gentleman. Most guys would already be trying to make moves, she interjected. I chuckled and replied, I'd be lying if I said that thought hadn't crossed my mind. You're incredibly beautiful and alluring. However, I hold you in high regard. Despite our recent meeting, I'm looking to build a meaningful relationship, not just a fleeting encounter. She leaned in for another kiss before saying, Me too. Shane, you're one of a kind, and I'm eager to get to know you better. Carrie came from a modest background where college wasn't financially feasible. Opting for vocational training in administrative secretarial skills, she had been employed by a successful small business in Austin for the past few years. Over the next several months, we grew close and fell in love. About 4 weeks after our first date, we shared our first cozy moment. It was passionate and intense, happening in the front seat of my truck after a movie. We barely made it to the truck before our desires took over. The windows fogged up, and the truck rocked as we experienced simultaneous euphoria. Carrie's fervor was undeniable, filling the cab with her cries of pleasure. We retreated to my home, spending the night entwined in each other's arms. It was a night of profound connection and passion, solidifying our love. In March, she moved in with me, and by June 1st, we were married. A little over a year later, Casey arrived, and for the next 23 years, we enjoyed a blissful family life. Though not affluent, we were content. Our bed life remained vibrant, with Carrie's passion never wavering, and neither did mine. Admittedly, over the past 5 or 6 months, our closeness had slowed, but the spark still seemed present. Or did it? Here's the situation 23 years later. About half a year back, Carrie landed a fresh job as the executive secretary for the CEO and proprietor of BRB Enterprises. Her employer, Benjamin Brockman, owned a manufacturing firm specializing in high-end electronics for the U.S. government. Given his considerable wealth, I assumed his company was thriving, especially since he was its sole owner. Carrie seemed quite fond of her new position and often spoke highly of her boss, Ben. Initially, I felt a twinge of jealousy until I met him. At 58 years old, he was balding and overweight, making me feel like a model compared to him. When I queried Carrie about it, she laughed, reassuring me that no one could hold a candle to me, babe. She frequently expressed her appreciation for our cozy moments, which eased my concerns. However, my unease resurfaced when Carrie began accompanying him on business trips lasting 2 or 3 days. Despite my inquiries, she dismissed them as routine work duties, insisting that she had her own accommodations and that they were entirely focused on business matters. Although still somewhat apprehensive, Carrie gave me no cause for doubt, so I refrained from further discussion. That brings me to that pivotal Friday. After returning home from school, I headed straight for the barn, where I'd been for about an hour when Carrie arrived. As she got out of her car and started walking toward the house, I called out, expressing my eagerness to see her and offering to prepare steaks for supper. Carrie, having been away on another 3-day business trip with her boss, glanced my way, but only nodded before entering the house. Inside, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and asked if she would prefer a beer or a glass of wine. She replied that a glass of wine would be lovely, still avoiding eye contact and staring at the floor. Sensing her unease, I brought her a glass of wine and placed the bottle beside her. Finally looking up at me, Carrie appeared troubled. After exchanging a kiss and hug, I inquired about what was wrong, noting her seeming distress. Carrie drained her wine glass in one gulp before pouring more, her actions betraying her inner turmoil. I reassured her, urging her to share what was on her mind, assuring her it couldn't be that bad. She responded, indicating the gravity of the situation and asking me to listen without interruption before continuing. With bated breath, I awaited her revelation, unprepared for what would come next. Shane, I need you to understand that I love you wholeheartedly. What I'm about to say isn't a reflection of you being inadequate as a husband, partner, friend, or father. You're the most incredible man I've ever known. As she spoke, I sensed this conversation was heading toward a life-altering revelation. Shane, I've made the decision to file for divorce. I'll be leaving immediately. Your concerns about Ben and me are valid. We've been having an affair for the past 5 months. He's fallen deeply in love with me, and we plan to marry once our divorce is finalized. We'll divide everything equally, but you'll keep the house, ranch, and all possessions. I'll only take my clothes and personal items. Pausing briefly, she allowed her words to sink in. Go ahead, I replied, surprisingly composed, despite the seething anger and profound hurt inside me. I'll file for a divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Let's make this process as swift, straightforward, and painless as possible, she continued, giving me an opportunity to respond. And respond I did. Carrie, do you love Ben? I respect him and find him intriguing. Perhaps I'll come to love him in time. Carrie, does Ben fulfill you physically more than I do? Is he a better lover? Were you dissatisfied with our closeness? No, Shane. He doesn't even come close. You've always been a fantastic lover, and I've always been satisfied by you, she reassured. Have I mistreated you? Are you unhappy with me? I'm struggling to comprehend why you're ending our marriage and breaking up our family. Carrie, I'm genuinely confused, I admitted. Shane, when I'm kind to Ben, he lavishes me with extravagant gifts. He loves me deeply and enjoys demonstrating his appreciation. He believes marrying him would provide a life of ease, free from work and abundant in luxury, fancy cars, global travel, designer clothes, and fine dining, she explained. So this is about money? You're trading up for a wealthy man? Well, Carrie, there's a word for what you're doing. And it starts with app, I retorted bitterly. Carrie protested tearfully, insisting that she was not a call girls. She expressed regret for causing me pain, but explained her decision to pursue the opportunity to marry a wealthy man. I responded, conveying the immense pain her actions were causing me. I expressed my disappointment, recounting the 23 years of hard work and dedication I had given to provide for her, offering everything from love and affection to my heart and soul. Apologizing for not meeting her expectations with my income, I requested some time alone and informed her that I would be in the barn while she packed, sensing Carrie's remorse. But her focus seemed fixed on her newfound wealth. As I sat on a bale of hay in the barn, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. This was different. This time tears streamed down my face. I rarely cried. My father had taught me that men don't. Yet, in that moment, I felt like utter despair. What could I have done differently? Was this my fault? These thoughts pierced my heart as I wept, realizing this would be the last time Carrie would bring me to tears. Carrie entered the barn, glanced at me, and exclaimed, "Oh my God, what have I done? Shane, you never cry. Have I hurt you that much? Oh, Shane, I am so sorry." "Well, Carrie, out of nowhere you come home and drop the bombshell. You're wrecking our marriage, tearing our family apart, moving out, and filing for divorce. And for the past 5 months, you've been with another man. To top it off, you claim it's because I didn't earn enough money, yet you say you still love me. But it seems love means nothing to you anymore. Shane, I've got to go. Ben and I are flying to Paris early tomorrow. We'll be gone a few days. When I return, I'll start the divorce proceedings as soon as possible." "You seem in a hurry to throw away our 23 years together. Have you considered Casey's reaction? I'll call her tonight. She'll understand. Ben has promised to buy her a new Mercedes and pay off her college loans, including the ones you took out." "No thanks, Carrie. I can handle my own loans, and I doubt Casey can be bought like you have been." She gave me a strange look but remained silent. "You better go, Carrie. But know that once you leave, it's final. I won't take you back. This spells disaster, so don't come crying to me. Oh, and make sure to please your sugar daddy tonight." I sensed she pondered my words for a moment. I thought she might reconsider. But then she bid, "Goodbye, Shane. I love you and will miss you." With a soft reply, I said, "I love you too, Carrie." After sitting down and shedding more tears, I eventually gathered myself and made a decision to move forward. Addressing my 2 horses, I acknowledged that they were now the only females left in my life and expressed my confidence in their loyalty. I walked over, petted them both, and they responded with nods and nudges. Heading back to my empty house, I grabbed another beer. About an hour later, Casey called. "Dad, are you okay? I just talked to Mom. Has she lost it? What's she thinking?" "She's hooked up with a sugar daddy and believes his wealth will bring her happiness." I replied, "I guess I couldn't fulfill all her desires in life." "That's garbage, Dad. She believes that old creep and his money will complete her life. She tried to convince me he'll be a great stepdad, promising me a new car and paying off my college loans. I told her to stick that car where the sun don't shine." I had to chuckle. Thank goodness my daughter saw through it. I assured her and we chatted, lifting my spirits. She pledged her support and vowed to steer clear of the sugar daddy. After a few beers, I drifted off to sleep on the couch, but my night was troubled by several unsettling dreams, one of which took place in a mall. In the dream, I stumbled upon Carrie performing mouth lovemaking on Ben in a women's dressing room. She glanced up, laughed, and continued, despite Ben's notably short member measuring merely 2 inches. The next morning, my old college roommate Jerry called and greeted me, mentioning that we had stayed in touch over the years. He reminded me that he works for the FBI's fraud division and had served as my best man at our wedding, remaining one of my closest friends. It had been a couple of months since our last conversation. I responded to Jerry's greeting, asking how he had been. He replied that he had been pretty good and inquired about my well-being. I admitted that things weren't going so great, explaining that Carrie had left me the day before and was seeking a divorce, which was why I was reaching out. Jerry expressed urgency in needing to see me as he was in town, offering to come quickly if it was okay with me. I questioned Jerry about how he could have known about Carrie leaving me, to which he replied that he didn't actually know. However, he had some information to share that he believed would interest me. Agreeing to meet shortly, I pondered what Jerry could possibly know about my situation. It all seemed increasingly bizarre. Though thoughts of revenge hadn't crossed my mind, I had a sinking feeling they were imminent. Jerry arrived about 30 minutes later, and I offered him a cup of coffee as we settled on my back deck on that lovely morning. Jerry remarked on the peaceful and beautiful surroundings before expressing his regret about the end of my marriage. Though I shared everything with him, He didn't seem surprised. "Jerry, it seems like you already knew about Carrie and Ben," I remarked. "Shane, what I'm about to tell you stays between us," Jerry cautioned. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but as your friend, I feel obligated. We never had this conversation and you can't share it with anyone." "Of course, Jerry. This sounds more serious than just a marital issue," I replied. "It is, Shane. It's also official business on my part. I'm involved in an operation concerning Benjamin Brockman. We suspect he's been committing fraud with government contracts, potentially defrauding the U.S. government of millions. If proven, he's in serious trouble. We've been undercover, gathering evidence for several months. Another couple of months, and I think we'll have all the evidence we need to bring him to justice." "Wow, Jerry, this is fantastic. I despise that idiot. I'd do anything to see him brought down. It would serve Carrie right. And how could she be so foolish? Leaving you for that idiot was a dumb move on her part. Plus, since Carrie is his executive secretary, she's become a person of interest in this investigation." "Holy crap. Jerry, is Carrie implicated in this fraud?" "We don't believe so. We haven't found any evidence indicating she's aware of his crimes. However, she'll become entangled eventually. When everything unravels, she'll be in for a rude awakening. She believes she's gaining a wealthy new husband and will live happily ever after. During our surveillance, we uncovered Carrie's affair with Ben. I was waiting until I had solid proof. Then I planned to inform you, Shane. I suppose her lust for wealth led her to betray you." Jerry opened his briefcase and produced a large envelope. Tossing it to me, he said, "Here's plenty of evidence of their affair if you want to use it in your divorce. If anyone asks, you didn't get this from me." I opened the envelope. Inside were 8 X10 photos, emails, and several explicit videos clearly showing them having lovemaking, accompanied by dates and times. It was difficult to look at and stirred up my emotions once again. I maintained my composure and thanked Jerry for his efforts. Interestingly, in the close-ups of her face during lovemaking, Carrie didn't seem to be enjoying it at all. There was a lot of faking on her part. I know how she acts when pleased, and I never saw her behave like that during our lovemaking. Another ironic detail. Ben did indeed have a small male organ. Jerry mentioned he had to return to work. He informed me that he would be in town for a few more days, but anticipated D-Day with Brockman to be imminent. "Jerry, how about we grab dinner tomorrow night? It's on me for all you've done for me in this mess." "Sounds great, Shane. My sister Ashley is coming tomorrow. Would it be all right if she joined us?" "Absolutely. I haven't seen her since she was 13 in braces. She's 36 now and quite stunning, I hear." Ironically, her divorce was finalized today. Seems she returned home early from a business trip and caught her husband in bed with his secretary. We might have something to discuss then. She's a partner at a corporate law firm, and she's here to open a new office for them. Perhaps she could assist you in finding a good divorce attorney. I'll definitely ask her about that. See you tomorrow. I met Jerry and Ashley at a local Mexican restaurant the following evening. Jerry's sister was indeed stunning, as he had described. She greeted me warmly with a hug and a kiss on the cheek. I teased her about her transformation from the little 13-year-old with braces and pigtails, to which she giggled and responded that she had grown up and become a woman. Reflecting on the past, I acknowledged teasing her about her braces and admitted that she had turned out to be one of the most beautiful women I had ever met. During dinner, Ashley and I discussed my situation, as Jerry had briefed her on the details. We agreed to keep it confidential due to the ongoing investigation. Jerry mentioned I could release the photos and videos, claiming they were obtained by a private investigator. I informed them of Carrie's plan to file for divorce upon her return from Paris, citing irreconcilable differences. "Crap," Ashley interjected. "You need to take the offensive. I know an excellent family lawyer who specializes in infidelity divorces. She took my ex-husband to the cleaners. I have her card in my hotel room. We can grab it later and get started on Monday so you can serve Carrie when she returns from Paris." Things were moving quickly, but I was impressed with Ashley's assertiveness and wondered if she'd be interested in going out with me. Towards the end of dinner, Jerry received a call and had to leave. He offered to cover the bill, but I insisted it was my treat. Ashley and I finished our margaritas and prepared to leave. She suggested going dancing since the night was still young. I agreed that there was a place nearby. We spent the next 2 hours dancing, drinking beer, and thoroughly enjoying each other's company. To say we hit it off would be an understatement. We seemed incredibly compatible. I felt relaxed and content in her arms. Afterward, we returned to the restaurant to retrieve her car. She asked me to follow her to her hotel so she could give me the lawyer's card. Once in her room, she handed me the card and instructed me to call her friend's cell phone the next day, suggesting a meeting on Monday. She assured me that she would also inform her friend in advance, expressing confidence that her friend would be accommodating since they were close. Expressing gratitude, I asked how I could ever repay her. She responded by throwing her arms around me and kissing me passionately. We both engaged in the kiss and then moved to the bed, where we continued to passionately make out for a few minutes until we both needed to come up for air. During the pause, I expressed my desire to kiss her since I first saw her, to which she reciprocated, complimenting me on my looks and handsomeness. We continued kissing passionately, and our hands began to explore each other. She touched me through my jeans, and I felt incredibly aroused. As my hand slipped under her blouse, I suggested that we should take it slow, expressing concern about taking advantage of her in her vulnerable state after her recent divorce. She responded, asserting her independence as a grown woman and stating that she knew what she wanted. She admitted being deeply attracted to me and hoped that I felt the same, implying that she might be the one taking advantage of me. She recounted her initial reaction to discovering her husband's affair, admitting that she initially blamed herself and questioned if she was lacking in some way. However, she eventually came to the realization that it wasn't her fault, recognizing her own attributes of youth, attractiveness, and confidence. She expressed hope that I didn't blame myself for Carrie leaving, as she initially did in her own situation. She shared her thoughts from the previous night, where she had wondered if she had caused everything, questioning if she was a bad husband who couldn't fulfill all of his wife's needs. However, after spending time with me that night, she concluded that it wasn't her fault. He mentioned that he had been a good father, husband, and lover, providing everything he could. They kissed some more, but mostly just cuddled on the bed, finding comfort in each other's presence. The next morning, they woke up in each other's arms. He invited her to lunch at his house and suggested they go horseback riding, which she enjoyed. Later, they ended up on the couch, where things heated up again, but it remained only a heavy makeout session. He mentioned that they decided to continue seeing each other and see where it leads. He took Monday off and met with Julia, the attorney recommended by Ashley. He recounted his story and presented all the evidence he had. Julia appeared disgusted with his wife's behavior and attitude, which didn't surprise him given her 30 years of experience as a lawyer. She proposed filing for divorce based on infidelity and abandonment, seeking ownership of the house, ranch, and assets. They had $10,000 in savings, which they would split. I would retain all the money in our checking account. Ashley was already paying her car payment, and her credit card was in her name, so she would keep them in her name. I covered her car and health insurance. Julia advised me to cancel both as soon as possible. Any credit cards in both our names would be canceled. Julia pretty much covered all my bases. She said we would only use the explicit photos and videos if necessary. Julia wanted to know when Carrie would be back from Paris. I told her it was supposed to be Thursday morning. I provided Julia with the address Carrie had left me in case of any mail forwarding. Julia said she would serve her Thursday morning. She may not like the infidelity part, but I think she will agree to everything else. She seems satisfied with her new financial situation and eager for a quick divorce, so she can marry Mr. Brockman. Julia proposed informing Carrie that she would modify the infidelity section of the divorce papers if she signed them as they were. I responded affirmatively, expressing the desire for Carrie to acknowledge her infidelity. Around 10:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, my cell phone rang, and since I didn't have a class, I answered it. It was Carrie, sounding upset, questioning why she had received divorce papers, as we had agreed that I would file for divorce. I explained to Carrie that I hadn't agreed to anything and that I was simply trying to expedite meeting her wishes. She questioned the content of the divorce papers, particularly the mention of infidelity and abandonment, which I suggested changing to irreconcilable differences. Carrie reiterated that she hadn't agreed to anything and proposed that I accept the settlement, indicating that I would soon be a wealthy man's wife. She offered to modify the infidelity and abandonment grounds to irreconcilable differences if I signed the settlement as it was. I informed Julia that Carrie wanted the revised copy, which she would have Ben's lawyer review. If he approved, Carrie would sign. After briefing Julia on my conversation with Carrie, Julia had the updated papers ready to send over, as she had anticipated. Julia mentioned that she knew Ben's lawyer, describing him as a corporate attorney with no experience in divorce, predicting that he would likely advise Carrie to sign without much consideration. True to Julia's prediction, Carrie signed the papers, and they were returned to Julia's office by Friday afternoon. I stopped by and signed them on my way home from work. The divorce would be finalized in 60 days. I called Ashley, and we arranged to meet for dinner near her new office. We had a pleasant dinner and talked for about 2 hours. Ashley sensed that I needed to discuss everything, and indeed I did. We decided to refrain from any cozy activities that night and save them for Saturday night instead. Later that night, Carrie called and expressed concern about my well-being. She informed me that she no longer had the right to use terms of endearment with me. I was firm in stating that I would survive despite the pain she had caused me, emphasizing that she had hurt me deeply. However, I also conveyed that it didn't matter anymore as she had achieved what she wanted, and unfortunately, I was no longer what she desired. Carrie expressed remorse, saying she didn't mean to hurt me and that she still loved me very much. I responded dismissively, informing her that in the settlement, I would be canceling her car and health insurance, waiting until next Friday for her to arrange coverage. She thanked me and assured me that Ben would take care of everything. I clarified that I wasn't worried, I was just letting her know. As our conversation neared its end, Carrie bid goodbye, expressing hope that I wouldn't think she's a terrible person for her actions. She stated that she had to do what she had to do and reiterated her love for me. At this point, I began to feel emotional. I was sure Carrie could sense my final words, expressing my farewell and wishing her a nice life with her new man. I ended the call before she could say anything else. It was time to embark on my own new life, and I had intentions for Ashley to play a significant role in it. Ashley arrived at my house on Saturday night at 6 o'clock. She looked stunning and alluring. Let me paint you a picture. She stands at about 5 feet 9 inches, with long blonde hair, shapely legs, and the most perfect curves I've ever seen. She looked like a goddess incarnate. Her full, shapely lips begged to be kissed. She wore a cute little red dress that accentuated her figure, revealing some cleavage. My excitement was already evident, straining against my jeans. We enjoyed a lovely dinner on my deck overlooking the ranch, accompanied by plenty of wine. We dined, drank, flirted, and conversed for about 2 hours. Finally, she looked at me and conveyed that if I didn't take her to bed soon, she would explode, referring to me as cowboy. I literally swept her off her feet and carried her to my bedroom. We wasted no time undressing and indulging in each other's company. Over the next few weeks, Ashley and I spent a considerable amount of time together. I proposed that she move in, but she preferred to wait until after my divorce was finalized. Nonetheless, she often spent nights in my bed. About 5 days before my divorce was official, Jerry called me. He informed me that they were on the verge of taking action against Brockman and his business. Everything Brockman owned would be seized, as they had amassed substantial evidence and witnesses against him. What about Carrie? I inquired. She'll be questioned, but it seems she's in the clear. However, she'll be losing her financial support. She's in for a rough ride, Shane. That's her problem, I guess. Shane, I want you to know that my sister is thrilled with your relationship. She was devastated after her divorce. Is there a chance you might become my brother-in-law someday? I hope so, Jerry. It depends on whether she wants me to. I can tell you, though, that I've fallen in love with your sister. She loves you too, Shane. I'll keep you posted on the Brockman situation. I wouldn't be surprised if Carrie reaches out to you. It was Friday, and I was eagerly anticipating spending the weekend with Ashley. It also marked the day my marriage to Carrie officially ended. On my way home from work, I stopped at a convenience store for some beer for the weekend. What happened next could be called fate, luck, or justice, but it was certainly peculiar. Carrie called me. She wanted to meet. I agreed to lunch. I invited Ashley, but she declined, knowing the purpose of the meeting and trusting me to handle it. I had taken the entire week off from work, planning to resign once they found a replacement. Additionally, we were busy moving Ashley into my place. Carrie and I met at a nice downtown restaurant, per my suggestion. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw her. She had gained weight and frankly didn't look good. The past few days must have been overwhelming for her. It had been widely covered in the news, with her name mentioned frequently. There were even reports suggesting she was Brockman's mistress. I noticed people staring and pointing as she entered. Opting for an open area outside, we found a table away from prying eyes to have our conversation. Initially, we engaged in small talk, but it wasn't long before she broke down in tears. "Shane, leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life," she confessed. "I'm not saying this just because Ben got arrested. I realized it a few weeks after moving in with him. Initially, it seemed exciting, but the allure of money faded quickly. I was miserable, and I felt sick every time I had to be cozy with him." "I didn't expect this," Carrie continued. "I thought money was all that mattered when I left you. I've also been overwhelmed with guilt for what I've done to you and Casey. Casey barely speaks to me anymore. You didn't deserve that, Shane. You were a good husband and provider. I had everything I needed. I just didn't see it." "Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate your honesty," I replied. "But you made the choices you did because you weren't completely happy with me." "I was happy with you, Shane," she insisted. "I let that old goat manipulate me. He seduced me, convinced me to leave you for him and his money. The night before his arrest, he forced himself on me. He's a disgusting, perverted old man. I hope he rots in jail." Despite wanting to laugh, I refrained. "Where is this leading, Carrie? What do you want from me?" I asked. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pleaded, "Please take me back, Shane. I love you and miss you terribly. I miss our home, the ranch, the horses, and everything we shared. I'll do anything to make it right." "Carrie, do you truly miss me? Or is this because you have no money, home, or job?" I inquired. "I'm broke, Shane, with nowhere to go," she confessed. "But I miss you terribly. I want things to go back to how they were. Carrie, when you left, I made it clear it was final. There's no turning back," I reiterated. "Your departure was permanent." "I understand, Shane, but I need you desperately. I'm at my wit's end. You're my last hope." "I'm sorry, Carrie. I've moved on and found love with someone else. We'll marry eventually, but we're not rushing things due to our past experiences with our spouses," I explained. Carrie looked devastated, tears streaming down her face. It seemed she hadn't considered the possibility of me moving on. She sat there sobbing, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. "I once contemplated revenge when you left, but now I want to help," I said. "Is there anything I can do to assist you?" Carrie looked up and requested, "I suppose I was naive to hope you'd take me back. I don't blame you. I wouldn't take me back either. If you could lend me $5,000 until I find a job and a place of my own. I'm staying with a friend, but I need my own place." "How much do you need, Carrie?" I asked. "If you could loan me $5,000, I'll start paying you back once I find employment," she replied. As the waiter brought our food, Carrie began eating, but my appetite had waned. Observing her, I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check. Handing it to her folded, I said, "Carrie, this should help you start anew. You're a skilled secretary. You'll find a job. If not, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. I regret how things unfolded. My dream was to grow old with you, holding hands as Casey said her wedding vows, watching our grandkids take their first horseback ride, and being buried beside you on a ranch. It seems fate had other plans." With that, I rose from the table and left the restaurant. Placing a $100 bill to cover the bill and tip, I stole a glance back as she opened the check. Her expression shifted to disbelief as she looked up, finding me already gone. I had left her a check with a pointed message. Smirking, I departed. She observed from the deck as I drove away. Afterward, Ashley moved in, and we tied the knot the following spring. Jerry served as my best man, and Casey assumed the role of maid of honor, having become close friends. The wedding occurred in Vegas at Caesar's Palace, with a select group of friends and family in attendance. The reception was held in our honeymoon suite, creating a memorable affair for everyone. I struck it lucky, winning over $200,000 on a progressive slot machine, showcasing my knack for accumulating money through gambling. Carrie wasn't part of the festivities, but she got wind of the news through the local paper. Eventually, she found a job and a place to live, though she never reimbursed the loan, which I didn't anticipate. Rumor has it she's now dating a high school English teacher, and I hope it brings her happiness. Meanwhile, Ben Brockman faced trial and was convicted of federal crimes. All his assets were seized to repay the government, and he'll be spending a considerable time behind bars. Perhaps he'll find companionship more suited to his taste there.
Caught my cheating wife at a restaurant, confronted her, divorced her, then ghosted her forever. The entire episode kicked off when I ventured into an unfamiliar place. Having dropped off one of our more bothersome clients at the airport, enduring a morning filled with his complaints, I felt no rush to return to the office. Given the dreary Tuesday and the prospect of an afternoon reviewing contracts, I decided to stop at a drab-looking bar restaurant about a mile from the airport. The plan was to enjoy a leisurely lunch and a beer or two before heading back to work in the salt mines. Seated in a booth, savoring my beer and contemplating the challenge of finding a decent burger in this world, my attention was captured by a couple entering the restaurant. Observing as they settled into a booth across the room, sitting side by side, I couldn't help but notice the woman. A shapely blonde in a short skirt, showcasing her attractive legs, paired with a tight pink short-sleeved top. Her companion seemed like a thug wannabe, struggling to pull off the look in skinny jeans and a black leather jacket. My heightened interest in this seemingly happy couple becomes clear when I reveal that the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law, and the guy with her was undoubtedly not her husband, my brother Dave. Worse still, it was evident they were more than casual acquaintances. They placed their drink orders with the waitress and immediately engaged in unrestrained displays of affection, necking in the booth. Shocked, I watched as the guy slid his hand up her thigh, under the short skirt. Shelley broke their kiss, letting her head fall back against the booth, sighing. The question wasn't whether I would address this situation, that was a given. The real dilemma was whether I could restrain myself from confronting them violently right there in the restaurant. I had never been fond of Shelley, disliking her from the time my brother started dating her. My pessimism persisted when he fell head over heels in love with her and announced their marriage just 4 months into the relationship. Dave, at 23, seemed unaware of what he was getting into, however. There was simply no way to convey to him that Shelley was everything to him. To me, she was a pretty, cheerful, somewhat shallow and selfish girl, not nearly as smart or interesting as Dave himself. They both seemed to adore the same person, Shelley. He would do anything for her, and that's exactly what she liked. To my pleasant surprise, the first 3 years of their marriage appeared to be very happy. However, the scene unfolding 30 feet from me suggested that the happy days were over. The guy she was with now had his hand on Shelley's waist, kissing her neck as he worked her over. With her eyes closed, she didn't see me approach and was startled when I sat down across the table from them, casually greeting Shelley. The comical moment unfolded as her eyes popped open and her boyfriend pulled his hands off her. Turning to look at me, her face went from momentarily startled to stunned and then truly shocked. Her jaw dropped and she froze, staring blankly at me. His face held the same startled look momentarily before turning annoyed. Before he could speak, I continued in a cordial manner, inquiring about how she'd been and asking about Dave. Turning to him and extending my hand, I introduced myself as Will, Shelley's brother-in-law, emphasizing the connection to her husband, Dave. His eyes widened, and he sat frozen, ignoring my hand. Shelley began to recover herself, babbling about Robbie being an old friend. With a friendly smile, I casually remarked on the relationship situation they were caught in, leaving Shell gasping and hoping I hadn't witnessed their activities. Robbie abruptly stood up and muttered that he had to leave. Without even a glance back at Shelley, he walked swiftly out of the restaurant. Later, I casually remarked to Shelley that Robbie seemed like a nice guy and questioned why he left so suddenly. Internally, I seethed with rage at the treatment my brother Dave was receiving from this woman. Expressing my frustration, I kept my voice down but made it clear that Dave adored Shelley, doing everything for her. However, it wasn't enough for her, as she engaged in illicit activities with a questionable individual sporting greasy hair and a poorly executed Matt Dillon mustache. Shelley looked terrified, her face turning pale in response to my accusations. She stammered, trying to explain, but her voice trailed off without a conclusion. After observing her for a minute, I unleashed my anger, expressing disappointment at her actions. I questioned how long this had been going on and how many others she was involved with. Shelley pleaded, grabbing my hand desperately, and begged me not to tell Dave. Despite her pleas, I considered informing my brother about his wife's infidelity. I questioned whether he deserved to know the truth about the person he was married to. Shell was either incredibly naive or too stunned to think clearly. I pulled my hand free, contemplating whether I should reveal the painful truth to Dave. Her eyes were wild, and she seemed to be thinking frantically. I sat back with a smile, curious about what she would offer to keep me silent. Shelley, after some contemplation, changed her expression. She pleaded with me not to tell Dave, promising to reveal the entire story. According to her, she claimed that another woman, someone I was involved with, was cheating on me. I laughed at the seemingly far-fetched revelation. Shelley looked at me steadily, insisting that she wasn't kidding. According to her, the other woman had been seeing a guy from the health club for at least a couple of weeks. This certainty unsettled me, even though I knew it to be impossible. We had been together for 7 happy years of marriage and a decade overall. She was devoted, sensible, kind, thoughtful, and the most honest person I knew. She loved me, and I was sure of it, just as sure as I was of my own love for her. Shelley leaned forward, sensing my confusion. She claimed to be telling the truth, mentioning that the other woman had confided in her about the affair the previous week. I scrutinized her face, trying to gather my thoughts. Despite her initial terror, Shelley appeared calm and in control, as if she were sharing a genuine revelation rather than spinning a wild and desperate tale. While I couldn't immediately dismiss what she was saying, it was challenging to believe given our history and her recent behavior. Seated at the dinner table, my gaze returned to Shelley, who seemed to be anticipating my next move. Although I didn't reveal it to her, concealing her infidelity from Dave was not an option. I needed to uncover the truth about him. I spoke slowly, suggesting that perhaps we could reach an agreement. After some contemplation, I expressed my unwillingness to let Anne deceive me. I proposed that if Shelley could help me gather information about Anne's actions, I wouldn't disclose what I had witnessed that afternoon to Dave. However, I laid down a condition: she had to swear not to see Robbie or any other man besides Dave. Relief washed over her face as she swore to comply. She asked, "Will you have my word on it?" I remained skeptical about the value of her word. Responding to her question, I inquired about what she would be willing to do to fulfill her part of the agreement. Expressing my desire to gather information about Anne's affair, I suggested a plan to Shelley. I proposed providing her with a tape recorder to conceal in her apartment. The idea was for her to invite Anne over, offer some wine, and engage in casual conversation, encouraging Anne to reveal details about her affair. I specified that I wanted to know the identity of the man, when and how the affair started, how often she had been with him, and the reasons behind her actions. As I spoke to Shelley, I realized that I was starting to believe her unusual story about Anne's infidelity, which infuriated me. Shelley nodded in agreement, stating that she could carry out the plan. She suggested softening Anne up by sharing the details of my own affair, making it feel like a genuine relationship conversation. Sarcastically, I questioned if Robbie was the only one who had been involved with her or if there were others. She quickly denied any others, but I remained unconvinced. 20 minutes later, I was driving back to the office, contemplating somber thoughts about the potential end of Dave's marriage and the looming possibility of the end of mine. My first instinct might have been to call Dave and inform him about what I had witnessed Shelley doing, but I recognized that it wasn't an option. I had always been the steady older brother, while Dave was the charming and outgoing one with a history of short-lived relationships due to his talkative nature. When Dave met Shelley, everything changed. Despite being a confident and charming individual, he became a lovesick schoolboy. Within a month or two, Shelley had completely captivated him, and he was determined to marry her. Dave idolized Shelley, considering her incapable of doing any wrong. Knowing Dave's unwavering devotion to Shelley, I refrained from speaking to him until I had concrete evidence. I realized that he wouldn't believe she was cheating unless he heard it directly from her. Despite my hopes that Shell might be lying or mistaken about Anne's faithfulness to me, the likelihood diminished. The possibility that Shelley could have lied to me out of desperation crossed my mind, but I also considered the consequences of discovering it was all a fabrication. When I arrived at my office, I took out a pad and made notes on the steps I would have to take if the worst turned out to be true. This included considerations about credit cards, selling the house, transferring car titles, and more. I hoped that in a few days I would be able to discard that sheet of paper. When I arrived home for dinner, cheerfully humming in the kitchen as she set the table, she greeted me with a big hug and a kiss, appearing as the loving wife I'd usually be happy to see at the end of the day. Despite my suspicions, cultivated over the past 7 years, I knew I had to play the innocent husband for a few more days. Underneath the surface, I felt a mix of fury and hurt, unsure of how to process my emotions. We chatted amicably during dinner, but when she mentioned her workout at the health club during dessert, I couldn't resist a bit of probing. I casually remarked to Shelley, commenting on her recent dedication to workouts. I asked if the club was now offering free ice cream. She laughed, though I noticed a slight flush on her face. She explained that she had been enjoying the positive feeling of a good, sweaty workout and coming home to her loving husband. She also mentioned that a few weeks ago the black slacks I liked were starting to feel tight, but now they fit perfectly. She beamed affectionately, and despite my concerns about her fidelity, I couldn't help but appreciate her beauty and my love for her. If she were truly cheating on me, I couldn't help but feel conflicted and unsure of how to navigate the situation. Despite what the court calendar officially stated, my marriage ended exactly 1 week later, on another Tuesday. Shelley and I had orchestrated everything. I provided her with a small tape recorder to hide in her living room, and she arranged for Anne to drop by for lunch on a Tuesday afternoon when Anne had a day off from work. Shelley, who didn't have a job, kept me on edge throughout that afternoon in my office, pretending to work, contemplating what the women were discussing and its potential impact on my life. At 4:30, when Shelley called and informed me that they were done and Anne had left, my heart sank. Desperately hoping for a different outcome, I asked if Anne had talked to her about it. Shelley, sounding a little drunk, giggled affirmatively. She shared that she had told Anne about Robbie, and Anne in turn disclosed details about Moran, emphasizing that he was a really big fella. Feeling the tension, I realized I was squeezing the phone so tightly that my fingers ached. I agreed to drop by in 20 minutes. When I reached Shelley's place, she handed me the tape recorder at the door, reminding me of the promise I made not to disclose anything. I assured her that he wouldn't hear a word from me. I emphasized the importance of ensuring that Anne never found out about the recording, as she might become furious and potentially tell Dave. Nodding in acknowledgement, I turned and left. That evening was one of the most painful of my life. Knowing I couldn't listen to the tape until Anne was asleep, I continued pretending to be the loving husband. While she was still a little tipsy, she shared that she had spent the afternoon with Shelley and had consumed a lot of wine. Additionally, she was amorous. After clearing the dinner dishes, she pulled me towards the bedroom, asking if I had a little something for her tonight in a flirtatious tone. I questioned whether I could or even wanted to go through with it. The thought crossed my mind that it might be the last time I would ever have closeness with Anne. Still hoping against all reason that she might not have been unfaithful, I followed her into the bedroom, and we had lovemaking. For me, it wasn't making love. My torn heart and worried mind overshadowed any pleasure. We rested for a while in each other's arms, then repeated the act. A few minutes later, Anne was fast asleep, snoring gently on her side next to me. I retreated to the guest room, closed the door behind me, and listened to the tape. The first few minutes of conversation between Shelley and Anne were breezy and casual, with Shelley keeping the wine flowing. After a while, she confessed to Anne that she had something to share. She proceeded to share the details of her affair with the a-hole Robbie. It became evident that Anne was already aware of the affair, and Shelley was merely providing her with the juicy specifics to soften her up. Shelley executed her role admirably, even confessing with a laugh that Robbie was just the latest, not the best. There had been a guy named Ellis, but unfortunately, he had moved out of town. Anne giggled and pretended to be shocked, though she appeared to be enjoying the story. The explicit details of the sleazy narrative had little effect on me. I already knew what Shelley was, and the added specifics would only make it easier to convince Dave that she had indeed cheated on him. Anxiously awaiting the inevitable, I resisted the urge to fast-forward the tape. Eventually, Shelley redirected the conversation towards Anne, expressing curiosity about my story. She giggled, mentioning that all I had shared so far was meeting him at the health club and his well-endowed nature. My body tensed as I listened to Anne's voice on the recording, laughing and describing Moran as amazing, the largest she had ever encountered. She went on to share more details, expressing initial doubts about it fitting inside her, leading to laughter from both women. Overwhelmed by the revelations, I stopped the tape and leaned back in my chair, absorbing the painful truth. My marriage was now officially over. Did I even want to hear the rest? I considered letting my lawyer listen to it. After some thought, I switched the machine back on. It was time to face the entire story, confront the anger and pain, and begin the process of figuring out what the rest of my life would look like. Shelley inquired about the beginning of the affair, asking how it started. Anne responded, explaining that she never meant to cheat on me and felt terrible about it. She mentioned our happiness together and expressed her disbelief in engaging in infidelity. She attributed it to having a bad case of BDF, which she found amusing. Laughing, Anne heard Shelley ask about BDF, and she promised to explain after having more wine. Anne continued sharing that she had been going to the health club for a couple of years to avoid getting saggy and to maintain my interest. A few months ago, she started noticing a new trainer named Moran, describing him as hot, with broad shoulders and amazing muscles. She mentioned his flirtatious behavior with women and recalled witnessing him talking quietly with Patty McAllister, a former colleague. Anne watched Patty enter Moran's office, and later, in the locker room, Patty appeared well-drilled, exhibiting a dreamy-eyed look and a vague smile. I greeted Patty and noticed her happy demeanor. She shared that she had a bad case of BTF, explaining it as big tool fever. She giggled, ensuring no one could hear her, and recounted her experiences with Moran, emphasizing his sensational qualities as a love-making partner and the impressive size of his tool. Patty described how Moran had flirted with her, eventually convincing her to go into his office, leading to an ongoing carnal relationship at the club. She expressed that he was incredible, providing her with the craziest lovemaking she had ever experienced. While her revelations caught my attention, I had no initial plans to take any action, considering Patty's divorce status and her freedom to play with whomever she liked. Over the next couple of weeks, my curiosity about Moran grew. I responded more attentively when he flirted with me, such as brushing against me or touching my shoulder while assisting me with the machines. During one workout session, as I performed bench presses in a nearly empty area, he stood behind me as if to spot me. Looking up, I noticed his shorts right above my head, and the sizable bulge of his package caught my attention. I couldn't believe how big and thick it looked in his shorts. He smiled down at me, aware of what I was looking at. I almost dropped the bar on my chest but managed to finish my reps. As I put the bar back on the rack, he took my hand off the bar and slid it gently down over his shorts. His tool felt as enormous as it looked, and it was hard as a rock. Then, after a couple of minutes, he gently pulled me to my feet, looked around to ensure no one was there, and led me by the hand into his office. I wasn't thinking, kind of dazed. He locked the door behind us, sat me down in a chair, and without a word, pulled off his shorts, standing in front of me. I swear I wasn't thinking at all. We had wild lovemaking. By the time he finished, I was beside myself, exhausted and totally spent. Shelley reacted with an impressed wow, and it seemed like she genuinely meant it. She assumed that Anne had continued seeing Moran. Anne explained that after the encounter in Moran's office, she had drifted into the shower feeling dreamy and weak in the knees, wiped out. She cleaned up and went home, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of being discovered by me. Surprisingly, I didn't suspect anything that night, and it seemed normal. Despite my desire for closeness, she made an excuse, fearing I might notice a change. The following night, she mentioned giving me the full treatment, engaging in closeness until I couldn't continue. Anne admitted staying away from the gym for 2 weeks following the incident. I just knew I couldn't be anywhere near Moran without being tempted again. Finally, I told myself it had been a one-time thing. I was a grown woman with a wonderful husband, and I could resist him. So I started going back, and the first couple of times it was fine. Moran winked at me and flirted a little, but he left me alone, and I thought, this is okay. I'm over this. I relaxed my guard a little. Then about a week after that, he caught me again at the bench, and the room was empty. He got my hand on his tool, and in no time, we were back in his office. Shelley finished her sentence, expressing how much better it was. Anne, speaking somewhat dreamily, struggled to describe the experience. She conveyed her deep love for closeness with me, emphasizing our satisfaction in each other, and confessed that she had never been tempted to fool around before, even with a flirtatious coworker named Alex. Despite his success with other girls, Anne had remained uninterested. However, with Moran, she felt as though she had never experienced such pleasure before. Giggling, Anne acknowledged the absurdity of sharing such details, emphasizing that there was nothing particularly special about Moran. She clarified that she had no interest in him as a person or a lover. It was solely about the physical aspect. She referred to it as God's gift, prompting laughter from both her and Shelley. I listened to the two of them and felt the anger coursing through my veins. I sat through the rest of the tape, but there wasn't much more. Once he'd had lovemaking with her a second time, he gave up all attempts to resist. She'd been with him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month, and there was no sign she was ready to stop. In fact, she said that she'd been enjoying lovemaking with me more lately as well, perhaps because her secret was kind of a turn-on. It was clear that her BTF had overcome whatever guilt she might have been feeling about betraying me, the love of her life, her husband of 7 years, the man who was completely devoted to her and who still remembered what forsaking all others was supposed to mean. It took a while to think through my plans, and it was 2:30 a.m. by the time I went to sleep in the guest room. I was done seeing and sleeping next to her or even talking to her. I slipped into the bedroom and got clothes for the next day without waking her. At 6:30 a.m., I was up and out the door. I left a brief and cold note, trying not to reveal anything, stating that Anne had an early meeting due to my call, apologizing for forgetting to mention it. I made 2 copies of the tape last night at the office. By 8:30, I was on the phone with my best friend from college, who worked at a downtown law firm. I requested a favor, asking him to arrange an hour with the meanest and most bloodthirsty divorce lawyer in his firm. There was a moment of silence, and he expressed shock, apologizing for the situation. After a brief conversation, Eddie showed me into the office of Margaret Adamson, a lead partner in his firm known for her intimidating presence. Eddie had described her as someone even sharks would avoid in the ocean. Margaret's look and handshake confirmed that she meant business, and I was already relieved that she would be representing me rather than Anne. I played Margaret and Eddie part of the tape. After hearing the initial moments, Margaret instructed her assistant to hold her calls, and we listened to the rest. When it concluded, we sat in silence for a minute. Margaret then straightforwardly asked, "Okay, what do you want?" Expressing my desire for a divorce due to infidelity. I emphasized avoiding the cliché of irreconcilable differences. I mentioned being reasonable about our savings, but insisted on keeping the house. Additionally, I wanted Anne to revert to her maiden name, as I believed she no longer deserved to be Mrs. Will Harris. Margaret nodded, studying me intently, and then requested a brief break with Eddie to discuss the legal details. Within 5 minutes, I was back in Margaret's office, and she was ready to proceed. She assured me that the divorce would likely proceed smoothly with Anne accepting the terms. However, she mentioned that the tape would be inadmissible since Anne was unaware of its recording. I grimaced and disclosed the complication involving my sister-in-law Shelley's infidelity, her offer to help, and the content of the first part of the tape. I explained my intention to inform my brother, acknowledging that he would be devastated. Half ironically, I suggested Margaret consider handling my brother's divorce as well. She looked at Eddie and then back at me. We started by listening to Shelley's part of the tape, and after another huddle between Margaret and Eddie, she remarked, "Quite a pair of wives you two picked." Seeing my reaction, she apologized, acknowledging it was inappropriate. Margaret then outlined the situation, stating that the tape might not be admissible against Anne due to her unawareness. But Shelley could be subpoenaed to testify about what Anne told her. It shouldn't make much difference. Once Anne's attorney hears the tape, he won't be in much position to fight. In your brother Dave's case, the tape is admissible because Shelley knew she was being recorded, so she's got no defense whatsoever. That divorce will be easy as long as he's not totally unreasonable. Then there's the health club. We can sue both them and Moran. Moran won't have much money, presumably, but Eddie and I can pretty much guarantee you a nice big check from the club, somewhere in the high 6 figures to $1.5 million. The tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and there's no way in hell they would ever let this get into the newspapers. Think of all the husbands who'd be canceling their wives' club memberships. She laughed briefly, maintaining a somewhat intimidating demeanor. Margaret assured me that she would initiate the divorce documents, and Eddie escorted me out of the office. He expressed his apologies, assuring me that Margaret would fulfill my requests. Despite feeling terrible about the situation, I tried to smile and reassured him, saying, "It's okay, Eddie. This just means you and I will have more time to play tennis together." I expressed my gratitude, thanked him, and left. The rest of the day, I submerged myself in details. I arranged a locksmith to meet me at the house at 4:30. I made a dinner date with Dave so I wouldn't be around when Anne came home. I cut off her credit cards and arranged separate accounts for our money. And I wrote her a note. It took several tries, not easy to say goodbye to the love of your life, even under these circumstances. When I finally finished it, I put it in an envelope, wrote Anne's name on the front, and took it home. The locksmith finished by about 5:15. I had a beer, sitting by myself quietly in the kitchen. Then I taped the note to the outside of the front door, locked it, and left. I knew Anne would be home between 6 and 6:30. I idly wondered what she'd do first, try the door and find her key didn't work, or read the note. Our marriage is over now. You'll be free to play around all you want with Moran and his big tool. I've had the locks changed. If you want to get your clothing and personal things, call my attorney. I left Margaret's name and number. She'll arrange for you to have supervised access to the house when I'm not here. I won't be talking to you again. You broke my heart. I loved you as much as any man can love a woman, and I looked forward to our growing old together. Too bad our marriage vows didn't mean as much to you as some lovemaking with a big tool, or as much as they did to me. When Dave joined me for dinner, he immediately sensed that something was amiss. After placing our orders, I took a deep breath and disclosed that Anne had been cheating on me, and I was planning to divorce her. His reaction was evident, staring at me with an open mouth, a sight I hadn't witnessed before. He expressed shock, exclaiming, "Oh my God, Will, my God. Anne, are you sure?" Realizing the obvious, he apologized, acknowledging it as a foolish question. He could see the truth in my expression and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I did, sharing my hurt and despair with my best friend over dinner. The beers provided some comfort, but having Dave's unwavering support meant even more. Towards the end of the meal, I revealed another aspect, mentioning that there's one part of it I haven't told him. Shelley is the one who got me proof. She taped a conversation of her and Ann talking, and Ann told her the whole sorry business. Dave looked at me sympathetically, expressing his sorrow. He added that he hoped it wouldn't make me angry, but he felt lucky to have a fantastic wife like Shelley. He mentioned that he's not surprised she helped me, as she has always liked me. He acknowledged that I haven't always approved of her but began praising her. I couldn't bear to hear more praise for Shelley, especially considering the circumstances. I interrupted him, saying, "Listen, Dave, wait. Don't say anything else. Let me pay the bill and I need you to come back to the house with me." A note with "Will" written on it in a flowery handwriting was found under the screen door. Without reading it, I dropped the note on the hall table and ushered him into the guest room. I communicated the seriousness of the situation to Dave, expressing my love for him and emphasizing our friendship. He responded with a wary look, not accustomed to such conversations. I urged him to listen to a tape recorded by Shelley, instructing him to stay seated while I went to another room. Rewinding the tape to the beginning, I pushed the tape recorder toward him and left. In the subsequent moments, I heard quiet murmurs from the tape, followed by a crash. Dave, seemingly agitated, paced around while the tape continued to play until it fell into silence. Upon entering the kitchen, Dave confronted me with intense anger, accusing me of relishing in the knowledge about Shelley and deliberately keeping it from him. He berated me for allowing him to praise her without revealing the truth. He insisted that I must be enjoying the situation, accusing me of harboring a long-standing dislike for Shelley. In response, I stood up and raised my voice, questioning what I had just discovered about him. My glare intensified, and gradually Dave's demeanor softened. His shoulders slumped, fists unclenched, and he sat down at the table, resembling an old man. After a moment, he apologized, saying, "Sorry, Will. I know you're hurting, just like I am. It's just, you obviously knew about this. Why didn't you tell me?" "Dave," I said as gently as I could, "you know how you were about Shelley. You would never have believed me. Remember that fight we had when I criticized something she'd said to Mom? I found out about Shell a week ago and I knew that I couldn't possibly tell you. You had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday." The two of us emptied a few beer bottles while I told Dave the whole story. I began with seeing Shell and Robbie at the restaurant, then the deal she offered me, the making of the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. "She's handling my divorce, and she'll be happy to represent you too if you want. Our cases are pretty much a shoo-in," she says. We talked late into the night, and then Dave crashed in my guest room. He didn't have the heart to face Shelley. The phone rang several times, but we didn't answer it, and finally I just left it off the hook. A few days went by, and then a few weeks. Anne kept calling for a while, leaving me messages of her crying and begging to talk to me, but I didn't answer or call her back. I just didn't see any reason to talk to her. She tried finding me at work, but I'd asked our receptionist to tip me off, and I ducked out of my office each time she showed up. A couple of times I saw her car parked in front of the house when I came home from work, so I just drove right by and stayed away for a couple of hours until she left. Margaret Adamson did her work beautifully. The divorce papers were served. She fought through all the legal maneuvers that Anne's lawyer tried to pull, and a court date was set. In his initial conversations with Margaret, he claimed that no infidelity had taken place. Once she sent him a copy of the tape, we stopped hearing that line. Instead, he pointed out that the tape was inadmissible. Margaret didn't even dignify that one with a response. She just sat tight, and as the court date approached, Anne's lawyer finally called Margaret to ask for a settlement conference. The day after listening to the tape, Dave moved out of his apartment with Shelley and into my guest room. He drove over and watched the place until she went out, then called me. The two of us packed up everything he wanted and got out of there in less than 2 hours. He told me, "I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get the hell away from her." His eyes started to tear up and I turned away. Was it a good thing or a bad thing that I knew just how he felt? Shelley left me a couple of angry, cursing messages at home, a nice counterpoint to Anne's remorseful ones. After a day or two, I started screening the messages, deleting any from Shelley or Anne as soon as I heard their voices. Shelley called Dave at work and sent him letters, but he never responded to them. Margaret was handling his divorce too, and he and I just sat back and let her run the show. To my amazement, the lawsuits against Moran and the health club were resolved first. The one against Moran never went anywhere. He disappeared one day and left no forwarding address. But the health club, eager to avoid negative publicity, just as Margaret had predicted, reached a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a pledge of confidentiality and walked away with the largest check I'd ever seen. In less than 10 weeks, my brother was a rock, and I guess I was for him too. We lived like two bachelors, going out to eat a lot, taking in a ball game from time to time, or just sitting around and talking over a few beers. We talked about Anne and Shelley, about our lives with them, about how many great women there were out there just waiting for us. It wasn't easy to believe that last bit, and yet we were really able to help each other. I could see as plain as day that there wasn't a thing wrong with Dave that led to Shelley's behavior. She was simply a selfish strumpet. Likewise, Dave reassured me that Anne's cheating wasn't a reflection on me, just an indication of how screwed up she was. Neither of us probably believed the other one all that much, but it still helped to hear it. Dave was divorced first, as it turned out. He made it clear that he wouldn't talk to Shelley under any circumstances, and so Margaret handled the whole thing. She told him that Shell had fought for more money at first, but that with the tape she didn't have a leg to stand on. I went into the office with him the day he had to sign the papers. Shelley had already signed them. He smiled grimly, shook Margaret's hand, thanked her, and then went off to the men's room. I heard him crying through the door when I went to find him. 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, Anne, me, and the two lawyers. Anne's lawyer had agreed to a settlement but insisted on 2 conditions: that I drop infidelity as a reason for the divorce, and that I meet privately with Anne before we signed the papers. I told Margaret I was willing to see Anne, but not willing to drop infidelity. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give Anne a chance to persuade me. If she could do so, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences, that old standby. In a weird way, I was looking forward to hearing what Anne had to say. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I loved her for 10 years, and I couldn't really imagine simply walking away without one final conversation. When I got there, Anne was sitting in the conference room wearing a blue dress she knew I'd always loved. Her hair was shorter, and it looked great. She was pale, but she was the same beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "Okay, Anne, it's your meeting," I said neutrally. My heart was pounding, but I tried to look calm. "Just 2 things, all right? Please don't tell me how much you love me, and don't tell me it was just love-making." She flushed, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "Will, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I screwed up, plain and simple. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you. But it was just love-making. Nothing but a stupid impulse I gave into. You can't imagine how much I've gone over it, how many times I wished I'd never done it. Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you?" I had no intention of making this easy for her. Just being in the same room with her, knowing that we were about to separate for good and why, broke my heart all over again. I went to the window and gazed out, unwilling to let her see my stricken face. Behind me, I could hear her crying softly. "Baby, it didn't mean anything. You know it was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you. I know that, but it meant nothing to me. It has nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her talk a bit more, listening to the pleading tone, the sweet voice I had always loved, but not hearing a single word that I couldn't have predicted. She had nothing to say to me that I didn't already know, and nothing that made a damn bit of difference. After a while, I turned around and came back to the table, sitting down directly across from her. "And just so you know, I still love you very much, but it's over between us." She started to cry again. "You took from us, the most precious thing we had together, aside from our love, the bond of trust between us. How could I ever make love to you again, wondering if it was me you were thinking about or Moran and his freak show tool? How would I know whether you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late coming home, wondering what you were doing on your lunch hour, wondering whether you'd found another big tool to play around with?" I waited, but she had no reply to make. Finally, between the sobs, she said, "Please, baby, please, couldn't you give me one more chance? Anne, I'll give you a few minutes to think about this one. What if I had met some bimbo with fantastic big jugs and started bawling her on the side for a few weeks? Nobody I liked or respected, just a handsome girl who was a fantastic lay, who gave me a degree of pure physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the feelings of hurt, the sense of total betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts you'd have about your own attractiveness, the fears that you weren't ever going to be the one I really wanted?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "Will, I don't have to think about it. I've thought about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around?" And the answer is no, I couldn't. I just couldn't handle those feelings. I know that. So I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be a braver, stronger person than I could ever be, and to give me a chance to make it up to you. A lifetime to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you. There was silence, a minute, 2 minutes. As we looked at one another, both of us thinking about all we had meant to one another and how we had arrived at this point. I stood up slowly, hating myself and hating her for cheating on me, and now for throwing it all back on me. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. And I waited by the open door for a moment, looking back, giving her a chance for the last word. She had her head down, crying. She didn't say anything else. Margaret was waiting for me down the hall, a surprisingly sympathetic look on her hard face. Let her have irreconcilable differences, I growled. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me. Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few, but we weren't drunk. Listen, I said, I've made some plans. He nodded, and I went on. After the lawyer fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 of it in some nice safe places, so there will be a lovely nest egg for when we're old and feeble. But the last 50 grand has been designated to the Will and Dave Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start spending some of it. I've rented us 4 weeks at a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun, starting 2 weeks from now. Go tell your office you're taking some time off. We are going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 gay divorces, if you know what I mean. He just raised an eyebrow, and I laughed. No, a whole, gay as in cheerful. We've done enough moping around, telling each other how badly we've been screwed over. Cancun was a blast, or at least as much of one as it can be for 2 guys recovering from broken hearts. We got a lot of sun, played a lot of tennis, swam a lot and drank a lot, though we kept one another from going off the deep end. With each passing day, we got tanner, a little fitter, and slightly further from the nightmare we'd just lived through. And let me say, God bless my charismatic and charming brother. Despite the blow to his self-confidence that Shelley had laid on him, he got his old groove back, and we had a lot of female companionship. His favorite stunt, and damned if it didn't succeed 75% of the time, was to spot 2 attractive women sitting together. He dragged me straight over to their table, smiled winningly, and said, "Pardon me, ladies. I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Will Harris." Then it was up to me, the shyer one, to say, "Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Dave Harris." Then he would step back and, "Phew, glad that's taken care of. Now may we buy you a drink?" By this time the women were usually at least grinning, if not laughing. And we'd mostly find ourselves with female companionship for the evening. Sometimes the companionship lasted until breakfast. After all, unattached women in Cancun were as eager for fun as we were. I had maybe 6 different women in my bed over those 4 weeks, and I imagine Dave's number was a little higher. Mostly it was fun, just laughter and pleasure and keeping it light. The first couple of times I made love to a woman, I was tentative, distracted by thoughts of Moran and his huge tool. Even though both he and Anne were thousands of miles away. It was hard to compete with what I knew he had done to her. But the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new got easier each time. One-night stands may not be for everyone, or for every stage in a person's life, but they seemed to be what Dave and I needed. Only one of the women was different, Shannon, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than I was. We did all the same things, had some drinks, laughed a lot, went for dinner, did some dancing, and back to my place, to bed. She was handsome and responsive, as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. We had a lot of fun. When it got different was later, around 3 a.m. For some reason I woke up and just lay in bed, Shannon softly breathing in sleep beside me. Thoughts of Anne filled my head, Anne and all that we had had together, and how it had been taken from me. I started crying very quietly, and before I knew it, Shannon was kneeling beside me, holding me in her arms, saying, "Let it out, baby, it's okay." I was embarrassed, but I couldn't stop. She kept soothing me, and finally, in response to her urgings, I told her the whole story. By the time I was done, the sun was rising. We shuffled into the kitchen, and I made breakfast for us while she told me her own story. Also a divorce, no cheating, just a husband who grew ever more distant, ever more driven and career-oriented, until there was just no marriage left. She'd been on her own for nearly 2 years. After eating, we found our way back to the bedroom without a word spoken and made love. The night before had been screwing, fun, exciting, friendly, but just love-making. This time, we looked into each other's eyes, murmured tenderly, and found a very different level of closeness. My one-night stand with Shannon turned into 4 wonderful nights. In the afternoon, she left. My brother Dave was a little worried about me, I think, urging me to meet new ladies. He mentioned it was time to move on. I acknowledged that Shannon was special. He agreed, saying he liked her too. However, he reminded me that she had gone home, and we still had 10 more days to spend down here. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool, and by that evening we were chatting with two secretaries from San Francisco on their very first trip outside the United States. That night, they slept in their own hotel room, but the next afternoon Barbara joined me in my room for her first ever experience on foreign soil. Dave and I went out for dinner at a steak place we both liked. It had been 8 months since Cancun. Dave had long since found a terrific apartment he liked, but we still spent a lot of time together. Just after we ordered, Dave leaned forward and mentioned quietly that across the room, two couples had just sat down, and one of them was Anne, with some guy. I appreciated the warning, and despite my sudden thumping heart, I waited a few seconds before casually turning around to look across the dance floor. She had already spotted us and was looking steadily over at me. I gave her a friendly, non-committal smile and a wave, and she smiled back. Then I forced myself to turn around and chat some more with my brother. He inquired if this was the first time I had seen her since the divorce, and I nodded. I admitted that I didn't think I'd have this much of a reaction, but the surprise had something to do with it. I suggested to Dave that he do me a favor. Let's enjoy our dinner and not tell me anything about what she's doing over there, how she looks. I don't want to know. Dave agreed, saying that it's fine, and then he launched into a funny story about a CO worker who had been flirting with him for a couple of weeks. While he wasn't terribly interested in her, he was enjoying the game. While enjoying our coffees and casually observing the dancing couples, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard that familiar voice inquiring about my well-being. Rising from my seat, I gazed into Anne's eyes and offered a greeting, once again caught off guard. She suggested a dance for old time's sake, and I agreed willingly. As we danced, memories flooded back, her warmth in my arms, her beauty, and the nostalgia for happier times. Amidst discussing mundane topics like our jobs and the weather, we eventually lapsed into silence, lost in the emotions of holding her again. I reflected on the dances we shared and the realization that those moments were now memories. Towards the end of the dance, Anne pulled back to look into my eyes and inquired about my well-being. Despite not owing her any honesty, I decided to share my feelings. I expressed that I was all right, pretty good, I guessed. Some days were better than others. Seeing her that night, dancing together, was powerful, and I didn't know I would feel this much. Anne, with a serious expression, confessed that she wasn't so all right. She missed me every day, and being in my arms again had a profound effect on her. Unsure of how to respond, I remained silent as the music played its last chords. Anne hesitated to let me go and shared. A thought, had I ever wondered if I made the right decision? She admitted that she still thought about us all the time, but usually didn't get much past wondering why I made the wrong decision. Later, when I dropped Dave off, he expressed concern about my well-being. I reassured him, acknowledging the inevitability of such encounters in a small town. Confirming our tennis plans for the next day, I headed home. In the dim bedroom, as I undressed quietly, Shannon rolled over towards me and inquired about my evening with Dave. I shared the strangeness of the encounter, contemplating that it might have been for the best that she hadn't joined. She responded with a loving smile, proposing that I hold her for a few minutes. Embracing, I felt her tender kisses along the side of my neck, savoring her familiar scent.
I should have known something was terribly wrong the moment I heard Clara's muffled voice through the door that day. It started like any other Saturday morning. I was pottering around the kitchen, enjoying a rare moment of quiet solitude before the rest of the house stirred to life. The clinking of ceramic on the countertop as I prepared my usual morning tea was the only sound, until Clara's urgent whispers broke the stillness. At first, I thought maybe she was on the phone with a friend, keeping her voice hushed so as not to wake Ethan. But as I paused to listen, the harsh, conspiratorial tone set me on edge. There was no warmth, no laughter in her clipped words, just a forceful intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Handled soon, before he gets suspicious," she hissed, her consonants sharp like icy needles. "Just make sure you're ready to move when I give the signal." My heart stammered in my chest as the implication of her words sank in like a stone to the pit of my stomach. She was plotting something deceitful, something aimed at hurting my Ethan. Of that, I had no doubt. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law, Clara, collapsed around me. Gone were the innocent smiles, the loving embraces she showered my only son with whenever I came to visit. Just one short, overheard conversation, and the woman I trusted with my family's happiness was suddenly a viper, poised to strike at our very hearts. How long had this malicious deceit been going on under my nose? What fresh hell was she concocting against my beloved boy, her own husband? 1,000 frantic thoughts whirled like a cyclone as fury and disbelief warred within me. I wanted to burst through that door right there and demand the truth. To grab Clara by her slender shoulders and shake it out of her until she spilled every last treacherous secret. But something held me back. A fleeting wisdom warning me not to expose my hand until I knew what game she was playing. For all my motherly instincts screamed at me to protect my child, I realized the smart play was to bide my time and lay in wait. To gather what evidence I could of her betrayal before raising the alarm, at least until I better understood the viper's nest I had unwittingly welcomed into my family. So, I forced myself to retreat from that closed door, clutching the certainty of Clara's deception like a parcel of powdered glass. However sharp and wounding the truth, I knew it was the only way I could finally excise her lies from our lives for good. No matter what deep treachery she was spinning, I would not allow that deceitful snake to sink her fangs into my loved ones and inject her venom. If it was war Clara wanted, a war for the very soul of this family, then she just enlisted herself a determined enemy who would show no mercy in defending her kin. Our happy American dream of generations was suddenly hardening into a battlefield of looming familial crisis. But in that moment, I took a pained breath and soldiered on. For Ethan's sake, and for the sake of unraveling the dark truth before it ruined us all. I knew I needed concrete evidence of Clara's betrayal before confronting her. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch, paying attention to every hushed phone call and suspicious glance. The innocent facade she put on around Ethan only stoked my simmering fury. Finally, the break I was waiting for came when Clara left her laptop unattended in the living room one afternoon. A huge risk, considering what incriminating trails may be lurking in her digital footprints. I wasted no time seizing the opportunity to uncover the truth. With shaking hands, I lifted the laptop's lid, dreading what I might find, and that's when I saw it. The email correspondence laid bare like a ransacked tomb, her lurid sexts and explicit photos shared with not just one, but several men I didn't recognize. I felt physically ill, my stomach roiling as the full extent of her infidelity condensed into an inescapable reality. But even worse were the paper trails indicating her intentions to siphon money from Ethan's inheritance after taking out a secret life insurance policy. My hands went clammy, the laptop almost slipping from my grip. I couldn't process the malice, the sheer calculating greed she'd been operating with literally under our roof. This was so far beyond a simple tawdry affair. She was aiming to hollow out my son's life like a carved pumpkin and devour the leftover scraps. I don't know how long I sat there, tears of rage streaking down my cheeks as more and more damning evidence piled up on the screen. But eventually, the sound of the front door opening snapped me back to reality. I quickly closed the laptop, straightening myself up just as Clara emerged from the hallway. "Oh, good afternoon, Marlene," she chirped with that saccharine smile that turned my stomach. "Is everything okay?" I stared back at her, struggling to mask the disgust seething behind my eyes. She looked so unbearably smug, not an inkling of guilt over the depraved acts she'd been carrying out. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to grab her by her pretty, lying mouth and, no, I couldn't give in to that impulse, as satisfying as it may be. Not without irrefutable proof to back me up when the inevitable denials came. Steadying my nerves, I forced the most level tone I could manage. "Clara, we need to talk about what I found on your computer just now." Her eyes went wide, those loathsome lips parting in a small O as the implication sank in. But just as quickly, her expression contorted into a sneer. "How dare you go through my private things, you nosy old bat," she spat, all hints of sweetness evaporating like mist. "What, did Ethan put you up to this, trying to pin something on me so you can cry victim?" I recoiled at her venom, appalled at how quickly she went on the attack. But that contemptible, transparent attempt at reversal only strengthened my resolve. I would not be cowed by this vicious succubus a moment longer. "Don't insult my intelligence with your lies, you faithless snake," I shot back, feeling the words ripping up from my gut. "I saw everything on there, the texts, the videos, the policy info. You're nothing but a calculating, money-grubbing whore trying to bleed my family dry." Her mask shattered then, giving way to an expression of pure, glowering hatred. This was the real Clara. the soulless harpy hiding beneath cheap cosmetics and vapid smiles. As she opened her mouth to surely spew more venom in her sad defense, I held up a hand to silence her. Save your pathetic denials. We're done here. You and I. One way or another, I'm going to make sure Ethan sees your worthless soul for what it truly is. Your grip on this family is slipping, you treacherous snake, and I'll spend every last breath ensuring you slither back to the gutter you came from. With that vow lingering in the air like a prophecy, I turned on my heel and stormed out, leaving her to stew in the putrid mess of her own making. She'd been unmasked, her decade-long charade shattered beyond repair. From here on out, it was scorched earth. Or so, help me, Clara would rue the day she dared make an enemy of this mother's wrath. After my explosive showdown with Clara, I knew I needed to make my next moves very carefully. As much as I wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops and watch her world burn, a small voice of reason warned me to be strategic. I had the proof of her deceit, but would it be enough to convince Ethan? Sitting alone in my bedroom that night, the weight of it all felt crushing. How could I get through to my son, make him see the vile beast wearing his wife's skin? I didn't have the luxury of subjecting him to the graphic evidence. That venom could scar him forever. There had to be another way to peel back the scales from his eyes. That's when the phone rang, the caller ID displaying a name I wasn't expecting. Derek, everything okay over there? My brother-in-law's gruff voice crackled over the line. You've been awfully quiet the last few days. In that moment, it was like the universe was presenting me with an ally, someone to help shoulder this burden. Fighting back tears, I quickly unloaded everything to Derek. The overheard conversation, the emails, the videos, all of Clara's sordid transgressions laid out. There was a long pause before he finally responded, rage simmering in his tone, that godless little harlot. We spent the next few hours strategizing, knowing we needed an airtight case to make Ethan a true believer. As much as it killed me, Derek warned that simply dumping the evidence on him could push Clara to retaliate, try to manipulate the narrative her way. We need to bait her into slipping up, get her nefarious plans on record, so that Snake has nowhere left to wiggle, he said, his words like arcs of electricity reigniting my dwindling resolve. With his help, I began meticulously documenting Clara's daily activities, taking screenshots of her shadier behavior and cataloging every incident that reeked of deception. We'd get that hellspawn to show her true ugly colors eventually, and by God, Ethan would bear witness. And we had an ally in a very unlikely place. Derek's own daughter, Lena, my sweet, mild-mannered niece. When I finally confided the truth to her, the blaze that erupted in her eyes was stunning, almost feral. That backstabbing bitch has violated the sanctity of this family, she hissed, more venom than I'd ever heard from her gentle lips. Count me in to help take her down. I won't let that whore get away with this. With Lena joining the cause, the chink in Clara's facade finally began to show ever so slightly. My niece took great delight in concocting subtle ways to shake that wretched harpy's confidence, keeping her always just a bit off-kilter and paranoid, knowing we lurked around the corner. Every sidelong glance, every bitten lip and shift of the eyes when we'd suddenly appear, felt like a delicious victory. Clara was the trapped rat for a change, her beady eyes darting around as the jaws of ruination began closing in. Just a bit longer, and she'd slip up spectacularly. Gone were any hesitations about ruthlessly exposing this schemer's depravity. With Derek and Lena by my side, I knew I had the family's full might aligned against Clara's sadistic machinations. For months, that godless vulture had been feeding on our love, our trust, but now the predator was about to become the prey. Whichever hole Clara thought she could slither out of this through, we would seal it shut, without mercy. Her despicable reign of betrayal was nearing its inevitable, fiery end. And as the splinter of loved ones committed to her demise, we would ensure the inferno that consumed her left no secrets remaining. With Derek and Lena fully committed to our cause, we knew the key was to bait Clara into revealing the full extent of her nefarious intentions. Simply confronting her again would only cause her to lash out with more denials and manipulations. No, this venomous serpent needed to be flushed completely into the open. Our best shot was to dangle something irresistible in front of her greedy snout, an opportunity she couldn't refuse to take advantage of and swindle from Ethan. Derek had the perfect scheme, one that made my stomach churn with guilt, but was ultimately necessary for the sting operation. We set up an investment plan, make it look incredibly lucrative. He explained in hushed tones over coffee one morning. Give Clara all the breadcrumbs to sniff out, passwords, financial details, everything she needs. You want us to tempt her? I shook my head slowly. Deceiving her is one thing, but concocting an entire fabrication feels like we're stooping to her level of moral bankruptcy? Lena interjected, eyes blazing with determination. That's exactly the point, Aunt Marlene. We can't play by the rules with someone as unscrupulous as that two-faced gutter rat. We lay the perfect trap to make her true nature inescapable. As much as it turned my stomach, I knew they were right. Clara had declared war on our family a long time ago. Our mutually assured destruction was the only path to excising her malignancy for good. Okay, I relented with a weary sigh. If this is what it takes to rid us of that toxic succubus, let's do it. What's the play? Over the next few weeks, we carefully constructed an airtight honeypot tailored to appeal precisely to Clara's insatiable greed and blatant disregard for ethics. A too-good-to-be-true investment vehicle with documents and financials readied, just waiting for her thieving tendrils to start slithering all over it. Derek and I played the parts of bumbling family members, feigning confusion over these perplexing investments as Clara's eyes gleamed with avarice. It made me want to vomit, watching her perfectly conceal the ravenous glee behind that vapid beauty queen smirk as the trap was set. You know, these financials seem complicated, Derek said one afternoon as we discussed the details over lunch. I really could use someone smarter with this kind of thing to take a look. Like piranha scenting blood in the water, Clara's whole demeanor shifted, her carefully practiced look of concern barely masking the predatory hunger in her dark eyes. Oh, Derek, you know I'm always happy to help out however I can with this sort of thing. She chirped in that saccharine lilt that made my molars grind. Why don't you pass those documents along and I'll take a look this evening? No pressure at all, but I'd hate to see an opportunity slip through the cracks. The dewy-eyed look of faux innocence she shot my way caused a flare of anger to surge through me. That forked tongue might as well be lashing out between her deceitful lips. But I bit back the venom welling up, forcing myself to play along. Are you sure, dear? I feel just awful piling more on your plate. Absolutely. Think nothing of it. The raptor gave a disarming chuckle, waving away my faux concern with perfectly manicured talons. It'll be my pleasure to lend my expertise. I'll go over each and every detail to make sure we don't miss a single lucrative window. I caught the briefest of looks between Lena and Derek, then a momentary flicker of disgust at the shameless deceit saturating Clara's every word. But we all remained steadfast, treading carefully as the viper began uncoiling itself around our tempting lure. Thank you so much, dear. I can always count on you to look out for this family's best interests, I said, forcing the most warm, grandmotherly tone I could muster as the muscles in my jaw clenched. Whether Clara believed the sincerity in my voice or not, she simply offered one of her plastic smiles in return, already lost in the first visions of her duplicitous plundering. Like capturing a venomous serpent, we held our breath, waiting for her to fully slither into the trap's confines. The first phase was complete. Now all that remained was springing it shut, sinking our fangs into the very heart of this deception before ripping Clara's facade to shreds once and for all. With Clara thoroughly ensnared by the bait we'd laid out, all that remained was to reel her in for the ultimate undoing. Anticipation coursed through me with every concealed glance I caught of her poring over the fabricated investment details. The arrogant smirk curling her lips told me everything. This was the moment she'd burn her last credible mask to ashes. The plan was for Lena to take the lead, playing the role of naive accomplice to draw Clara's full corruptive forces into the open. As the youngest of us, she could most easily appeal to that Black Widow's sense of overconfidence and make her slip up fatally. I just don't quite understand these prospectus forms, Lena said with perfectly feigned confusion one evening as Clara leaned over the documents. It all seems so complicated, definitely more than I'm equipped to handle. That was Derek's cue to make an overly theatrical show of heading out. Well, If you bright ladies have it covered, I'll leave you to it. Marlene and I actually have an appointment to get going to. Yes, we really must get moving, I added with a pointed look towards my traitorous daughter-in-law. You don't mind keeping an eye on things here for a while, do you, Clara dear? The she-devil looked up from the papers with a smile so calculated it could have been printer-generated. Of course, I'd be simply delighted to walk Lena through all the finer points. And with that, Derek and I made our exit, leaving the trap ready to be sprung. I had to hand it to my niece. Lena played the role of helpless ingenue flawlessly, as Clara huffed and puffed through lengthy explanations, deliciously unaware of the noose tightening around her with every word. Sequestered away and monitoring the audio-video feed, I fought to keep my fury in check as Clara's contemptuous mask slipped fully away. The condescending laughter, the flagrant insults about our collective intelligence. It was like she simply couldn't resist the urge to revel in her own smug superiority. I swear, you poor dear, it's a miracle you're not institutionalized with how little you understand, she gloated with an exaggerated roll of her eyes. Thank goodness you'll have me around to handle matters like these. Lord knows your idiot family would bungle it into bankruptcy before the first quarter's figures even hit. Lena recoiled with a perfectly delivered flinch, suckering Clara into brazenly continuing her torrent of bile. Seriously, why do you think I've stuck around playing dutiful wife to that dullard Ethan all these years? Certainly not for his rapturous skills in the bedroom, I can tell you that. Her derisive cackle pierced the airwaves, the sound of rancid nails on chalkboard scraping against my very soul. Mercifully, Lena allowed only the faintest look of shock to cross her features in response. Well, you always did seem to dote on him so supportively, she managed to stammer through expertly feigned distress. Does that mean you've been faking it all along? In an instant, Clara's expression went predatory, like a shark scenting chum in the water as she leaned in conspiratorially close. Fake it? She hissed with sneering contempt. Oh, honey, I've been meticulously planning this family's demise since before I even met that sad sack of a husband. With those damning words vocalized, the final hook was baited. I watched in speechless revulsion as Clara enthusiastically divulged every last lurid detail of her machinations, the ulterior motives behind their marriage, the mistress arrangements with her lovers, the insurance fraud schemes, and slow marination of Ethan's finances into her control. She held nothing back, so thoroughly convinced of her complete triumph over our pitiful family. I've been drip-feeding that simple-minded oaf his own cuckoldry for years now, she cackled with revolting glee. And once I finally gain dominion over his family's assets, I'll detonate the whole truth bomb right in his stupid face, just to watch it shatter him. He'll be left with nothing, no wife, no money, no pride. Just a broken, blubbering mess for me to grind my heels on one final time before exiting stage left as the big winner. As her malicious victory lap reached its crescendo of depravity, I heard a sudden clatter from the other room as Lena lost her composure, shoulders heaving with rage and heartbreak, even through her acting talents. The counterfeit empress clasped her hands in triumph, savoring every last shred of her perceived conquest with sadistic glee. Her very presence was a cancer metastasizing throughout my entire family. But now, we finally had every last diseased cell captured and ready for the eternal quarantine it so richly deserved. With Clara's damning confession secured, the final phase of our intricate sting was deployed. We arranged for a family gathering under the premise of Ethan's birthday celebration, one final ode to normalcy before ripping the veil away. As the hours ticked closer, my nerves reached a fever pitch, knowing this intersection could shatter relationships beyond repair. But Clara's overwhelming malice overshadowed any fear. She needed to be exposed, no matter how much anguish it caused. Evil this deeply rooted could not be allowed to fester any longer within our family. Seeing Ethan's bright smile as he embraced his venomous wife made me physically ill. How could he remain so blindingly oblivious to the viper coiled in his midst? It took everything I had to play the role of doting mother, feigning joy as gifts were exchanged and celebrations commenced. When the moment finally came, I exchanged a subtle nod with Derek and Lena. They moved to seal the exits as I stood, clearing my throat to gather the room's attention. Even Clara tilted her head inquisitively, that plastic smile straining at the corners as if she could somehow sense the trap about to spring shut. "Before we continue with the festivities, there's an important matter we need to discuss," I began, unable to mask the tremor in my voice any longer. "Something that can no longer be avoided or swept under the rug." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet as all eyes turned towards me, Ethan's expression becoming one of sudden concern. "Mom, is everything okay?" Through the swell of nausea, I focused every ounce of resolve on the woman beside him, the soulless, depraved harpy masquerading as his beloved wife. Clara tilted her head in faux curiosity, but I could see the faintest flicker of panic in those beady little eyes as their inevitability sank in. "No, Ethan, everything is not okay," I stated with cold finality. "For years now, your family has been suffering an infestation of lies and betrayal, and it's time that cancer was cut out for good." A hush draped over the room like a suffocating blanket as the implications slowly dawned on Clara. I caught Derek inching forward from the corner of my vision, boxing in his prey. "You see, your dear wife here hasn't been quite the faithful partner she's made herself out to be. In fact, that woman is nothing more than a manipulative liar and an accomplished con artist, one who's been actively cheating and orchestrating your personal, emotional, and financial ruin." The explosion was immediate, Clara bolting out of her chair with a strangled shriek of indignation. "How dare you make such vile, outrageous accusations?" She spat with turbocharged venom, whirling on my son. "Ethan, you can't possibly believe a word from these deranged liars. They're just bitter, jealous old harpies who can't stand to see us happy." But Ethan simply stared back in mute horror, his world crumbling beneath the weight of her visceral panic. When no denial or defense came from him, the terror in Clara's eyes reached a crescendo. Seizing the moment, Derek and Lena moved in with the laptop containing her recorded confessions, allowing the raw audio to blast through the room in high-definition clarity. Every despicable admission, every scheme to financially eviscerate Ethan and destroy this family's legacy poured forth in Clara's own gleefully narrated voice. As the look of realization congealed on my son's face, she switched tactics with desperate, grasping sobs. "Ethan, my love, you know I was just venting. Talking tough to make myself feel powerful in the face of adversity. You understand, don't you?" But even through her crocodile tears, the monster's fangs dripped with poison. With a contemptuous scoff, she redoubled her efforts at manipulation through attack. "This is all just one big, pathetic setup orchestrated by your shriveled old mother to turn you against me. She's bitter and alone, so she wants us to be as miserable as her, and—" The deafening crack of Ethan's palm across her cheek mercifully cut off her bile, leaving her lips sputtering and eyes bulging in shock. Clara raised a trembling hand to her reddened cheek as my son looked on her with a gaze of molten disgust. "Get out!" The words fell like grave weights from his lips. But Ethan, my love, please, you can't mean—" "I said get out!" he roared with animalistic fury. "I'm alive purely because of these people, my family. But all you've done is try to defile that family with your greed and lies. You don't belong here among us anymore. You are alone now." I watched in stunned silence, my heart in splinters, as Clara's entire world collapsed around her like a grotesque imitation of a human being. Weeping and wailing her refusals, she was pulled bodily from our home, cut loose from the family's fabric like the gangrenous growth she was. And as the door slammed behind her sorry form, I finally had a chance to breathe again. The serpent had been severed from our brood, her venom finally defanged for good. In the aftermath of Clara's cataclysmic unmasking, the silence that blanketed our home was deafening. Like the uneasy calm after a tornado's passing, we were left to take stock of the upheaval and devastation left in its wake. Ethan retreated into a shell of mute shock and betrayal, unable to even look me in the eye. I couldn't begin to fathom the vortex of emotions swirling within him, the anguish of being so systematically deceived by the person he trusted most, the humiliation of being played for a fool, the rage at her depravity. Just watching his hollow stare was like bearing witness to a light slowly snuffing out. For several days he remained that way, a ghost drifting through these halls he once called home. Derek and Lena attempted to reach out to remind him he wasn't alone in his grief and anger. But the walls he'd erected to protect what fragments remained of his heart were impenetrable. For my part, I didn't dare force consolation on him too soon. As his mother, I understood this was a wound that would need time and space to begin healing properly. So I kept vigil, lingering nearby to let him know I was present, but never imposing. Just existing as a bastion of familial solidarity should he decide to lash out or crumble completely. Then, almost a week after that explosive confrontation, the other ongoing saga decided to rear its head once more. "Mrs. Harper?" The smarmy lilt of Clara's overpriced lawyer wormed its way through the phone line. "We need to discuss your client's grievous and libelous actions against my client. She's suffered great personal and professional humiliation at the hands of your slander, and we fully intend to pursue legal recourse." I rolled my eyes so hard I thought they might detach and go clattering across the kitchen floor. Even disgraced and excommunicated, that vile succubus still thought she could slither her way back through intimidation. "Save your posturing, you third-rate ambulance chaser," I sneered with more venom than I expected. "Your client is nothing more than a deceitful con artist who engaged in criminal fraud and infidelity against my family, all of which we have ample evidence to prove in court, I might add." There was a momentary pause as I allowed that truth to soak in. I could practically hear the hamster wheels spinning in the little weasel's mind. "Libel is still a very serious matter, Mrs. Harper," came the inevitable rebuttal in a tone much less assured. "My client will not take this lying down." "Then I warmly encourage her to pursue this case and fulfill her martyr complex," I interrupted, balling my free hand into a fist so tight I could feel the nails cutting crescents into my palm. "Because I can guarantee you the fallout of that deposition. The evidence will enter, the witness testimonies will compel, the sordid details that will be dragged out into the light of public record will reduce any remaining shreds of her credibility and reputation to ashes, unless she has a hankering for ending up completely destitute financially and socially." Whether it was the steel behind my words or the stark truth ringing in that miserable shyster's ears, the sputtering stopped abruptly. For a blessed few moments, there was only the delectable sound of their case's prospects crumbling to dust. "We'll be in touch," came the meek rejoinder before the line went dead. I let out a long, pent-up breath as the call disconnected. Just another toothless strike from a soon-to-be defunct adversary, forced to slink back into whatever rancid den she crawled out of. Still, it felt cathartic to be the one keeping the snakes at bay for once, the lioness fiercely guarding her bloodied pride's sanctuary. From the hallway behind me, I suddenly became aware of Ethan's presence hovering. Had he been there long, watching the display? I turned slowly to find him fixated on me with an indecipherable gaze. "You weren't kidding," he said, his voice sounding almost childlike with disbelief. "When you said she was toxic and manipulative, when you vowed to cut that cord completely, you meant every single word." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words never came. Seeing the rawness carving canyons across his face, my throat grew inexplicably tight. Before I could regain my bearings, Ethan had crossed the distance between us and pulled me into a stranglingly fierce embrace. "Thank you," he rasped, as I felt hot tears spilling down the back of my neck. "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us. You never stopped fighting for this family, and I'll never forget that as long as I live." Heaving sobs racked my own body as I hugged him back with equal desperation, my lips murmuring every soothing reassurance a mother could muster between gasps for air. United in our grief and deliverance, the broken shards of our trust began reshaping into something resilient, something resolved to never be betrayed again. We would savor this moment for however long it was needed to be fully bathed in the absence of Clara's venom. Then, when the last drops were expelled, we could finally begin putting the pieces of our lives back together. The weeks following Clara's excision from our family were a hectic whirlwind. Between fielding the occasional toothless legal threat and orchestrating Ethan's divorce proceedings, there was little respite from the lingering drama she insisted on fomenting. But with Derek and Lena steadfastly by my side, we weathered each pathetic gambit and postured maneuver from that miserable snake. united as a bastion against her final, desperate tantrum throes. Through it all, I made a concerted effort to keep extending the same patience and understanding to Ethan that he had afforded me in the aftermath of my beloved Teddy's passing all those years ago. The grieving process after being so insidiously violated can feel interminable, the wounds reopening with every triggered memory or habitual reminder. There were times the waves of anger, sorrow, and sheer disillusionment threatened to drown him completely. I'd find him sitting in the dark, clutching old photographs or staring blankly ahead as the reality of his defilement washed over him anew. In those fragile moments, I'd simply hold his hand and softly reassure him it was okay to feel utterly destroyed for a while. No words could anesthetize the all-consuming anguish. It had to be fully experienced, cauterized with time until the flames of betrayal burned down to embers. I'd been through similar depths before in the wake of Teddy's death and could impart that hard-earned wisdom. It was the only torch to light Ethan's path back from the abyss. As the proceedings wrapped up and Clara was expunged from his life for good, I could sense my son's scarred spirit beginning to slowly mend. The once hollow gaze regained tiny flickers of life and resilience. Each day saw him engage more fully with the world, rediscovering those simple joys and passions that she had systematically leached away. It wasn't an easy journey by any stretch, and there were certainly setbacks and backslides along the way. Forgiveness would prove the longest hurdle, both for Clara's unforgivable sins and his own self-pardoning for being so blasely blind to them. But we pressed on as a united front, applying familial love and understanding as healing salves whenever the old wounds began to fester. Then, a little over a year after that awful night of deliverance, I caught a glimpse of the light finally piercing through the storm clouds. Derek, Lena, and I had come over to Ethan's place for a small family dinner, our presence no longer stiflingly overbearing. As we sat around the table chatting over heaping plates, my son suddenly raised his glass in our direction. Can I just take a moment to propose a toast?" His voice sounded stronger, more assured than it had in months. "To the 3 people who saved my life in more ways than I can properly articulate." He turned to Derek first, offering a respectful nod. "You were the strategist, the voice of cold, pragmatic reason when my whole world was crumbling. If not for your insights and careful planning, I might still be trapped under that vile woman's control, wasting away in oblivion." Derek accepted the praise with a humble dip of his head. Ethan's gaze then fell on Lena, shining with unmistakable reverence. "You were our secret weapon, the warrior princess who stared true evil right in the face without flinching. I'll never forget your bravery, your commitment to defending me, defending all of us, from that. He trailed off with a pained look before recovering, his features hardening. "That a succubus like Clara was even allowed to smear her darkness across our family is a sin I'll spend lifetimes atoning for. But you were the light that cut through and banished her for good." Lena flushed under the weight of such admiration, flashing a reassuring smile. Finally, Ethan's eyes found their way to me, shimmering with a soulful depth that instantly reopened the cracks in my heart all over again. "And Mom, what can I possibly say to the one person who never stopped believing I was worth saving, even when the evil had corroded me down to my foundations?" I felt my throat grow thick as he reached across the table to grasp my hands in his calloused grip. "You fought for me, you clawed me back from the abyss of her manipulations with every last ounce of motherly fury. When everyone else had been so utterly deceived, you alone could still see my essence worth cherishing underneath all the toxicity. I'll never be able to properly repay that unwavering love and perseverance." Tears streamed freely down both our cheeks as mother and son embraced, allowing the roiling tsunami of love and regret, of deliverance and resilience, to crash over us in waves once more. In that moment, the last vestiges of Clara's blight were finally washed away by the restorative power of family. When we eventually pulled apart with weary smiles, I could see the man I had fought so fiercely to protect, shining through my son's eyes once more. Hardened by betrayal yet edified in spirit, ready to joyfully rejoin the world and have a fresh reckoning for the depravities lurking amidst the light. As the conversation resumed with laughter and fresh resilience, I caught Ethan watching me with a contented expression. A lifetime of adoration and hard-won wisdom passed between our shared gaze, the reconnected heartbeat of this clan united against any evil that dared to encroach. We were battered, slightly broken, but burning ever brighter, thanks to the cauterizing flames of last year's purgative inferno. Our family's sanctity had been violated in the worst way, but in the end, the sanctity emerged stronger through trial by fire. There was beauty in that resilience, that unyielding defiance against the darkness. And with it came a resolute sense of purpose moving forward, to fiercely protect the bonds of this family, this home, from ever being tainted or torn asunder again.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I first met Tim about 2 years ago when he walked into the restaurant where I was working as a hostess. We chatted while he waited for the rest of his party to arrive. He was tall, kind of thin, but with a toned build, and had this great, warm smile. I could tell he was a little shy from the way he spoke, soft, with indirect compliments, and how he avoided making eye contact. It was clear he was interested in me, but not in the pushy way some guys can be. The type that would have taken my playful touches as a cue to invite me back to their place. Tim, though, was different. He seemed like the kind of guy who genuinely wanted to get to know me. Now, I'm not a supermodel, but I know I've got my own appeal. My name's Kathy, and I'm 5 feet 4 inches, about 160 pounds, but it's all in the right places, my chest and hips. I've got a small waist, thick legs, long dark hair, and a smile that can light up a room. According to Tim, though, my best features are my deep green eyes, with my lips coming in a close second. At least, that's what he says. But when we were in bed, he wasn't exactly focusing on my eyes or my smile. As the night went on, I could tell Tim wasn't really into the whole gathering. The group he was with were clearly his co-workers, and while they praised him several times, he didn't seem comfortable. So, I decided to step in. I walked over to their table and told him he had an emergency phone call. He looked confused, saying no one knew he was there. I just smiled and guided him away, leading him into our employee lounge for a little break from the party. "Where's the phone?" he asked. "Well," I began, "you seemed a little uncomfortable, so I thought that I would get you out of there. If you want to go back, just tell them that it was nothing and continue with your party. But if you do want to leave, I'll go back and tell them that you were called away." "What do I have to pay you for doing this?" he asked nervously. I quickly wrote down my phone number on a piece of paper and said, "Call this number tomorrow, and we'll see what happens." Tim left the restaurant, and I went back to his table and explained that he had been called away. I didn't give a reason, so that he could tell them whatever he wanted, and there'd be no conflicts in our stories. The next day Tim called me, and I wheedled my way into a date. We had so much fun that I didn't want it to ever end. He did things for me that the thin, pretty girls take for granted and bigger girls get only before we put out, if ever. He was a perfect gentleman, and I loved the way he looked at me. Oh, sure, I sometimes wish that he was a little more forceful, but I was crazy about him, so it didn't matter. He closed his eyes and placed his lips against mine with a gentleness that I still remember today. And his arms, they wrapped themselves around me and just held me like I was the most precious object in the universe. At that moment, to him I really think I was. He also didn't just run his hands all over me, grabbing whatever he could. When we broke the kiss after what seemed like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This was my guy, and I was his. Over the next few months our relationship progressed at its own pace. We kissed more and often, we made out, and finally long after I was ready for it we had sex. I don't know why it took us so long, but it was great. I was kind of expecting to have him disappear afterwards like so many guys do. I mean, I'm not a BBW by any means, but I am a little bigger than your average girl, so I was used to guys who just wanted to take a spin on me and then send me back to the showroom. When Tim showed up the next morning before he went to work, which had never happened before, I was expecting him to break things off, since he'd had his ride. I almost tried to avoid him, just so I could enjoy the glow from the sex for a little longer before the crushing blow. He looked so sad, and then hugged me and gave me flowers and told me I was the most special thing he'd ever seen. I almost cried. I was so happy because I was just not used to this. A few months later Tim got really serious and scared, and I got nervous again. My mind told me that even this saint of a man had just gotten enough big girl sex and was ready to move on. "Just go ahead and say it," I told him. My voice was harsher than I wanted it to be because I thought I knew what was coming. "Kathy, I have a problem," he said. "So what's your problem? You want a skinnier girlfriend, right?" I snapped. He looked kind of shaken. After we do it, You mean after we have sex, you what?" I asked. As you can see, I was ready, Or so I thought. Well, I don't want to leave you. I just want us to be together more. So I was hoping, I know you're not ready to get married, you said, but my head exploded. Did he mention marriage? I was hoping we could live together, he said. I was shocked. I knew I was pretty, and there were some men who liked my body. Actually, most men liked my body, but they only wanted it on a trial basis. Tim, on the other hand, really loved me. I sat there with my mouth open. I was 27 years old, had probably screwed at least 15 or 20 guys, but I had never been anyone's girlfriend before Tim, and now not only had he mentioned marriage, but he wanted me to live with him. Half the guys I screwed didn't even want to be seen with me afterwards, and this guy wanted me to be solely his, permanently. Over the years, as you can tell, I developed a tough skin out of necessity. But that night it disappeared, and if I hadn't already been in love with the galut, that night would have sealed it. Our relationships did have one glaring problem, but it was minor. We were compatible in every way that matters, and rarely argued. He was content to spend most of his time just being with me. Of course, a lot of that time we spent in bed, but we were both happy, so who cares? Our biggest problem was Tim's shyness. He almost hated to be around people. I'm not talking about parties. I'm talking about any group of people where he didn't know or feel comfortable with everyone there. It took him 8 months to build up the courage to meet my parents. When it came to going out with my friends or coworkers, well, I was becoming a hermit. For the most part, it didn't bother me, but damn it if I was finally in love, and with a great guy. I wanted all of my friends to at least see him once or twice. I tried on several occasions to make it happen, but there was always something that came up. Usually, it would come up at the last minute, so he couldn't make it. I always ended up going alone or not going. Some of my coworkers were beginning to think the photo on my desk was a fake. I'd hear the meaner ones talking behind my back. Really, who would want to be with that cow? Or, those fat girls will say anything. So when Rochelle Davenport, our district manager, had a big party planned at her house, I put my foot down. Tim, I said, if you can't manage to spend one evening with my coworkers, for me, then maybe you don't love me as much as you claim to. Maybe this relationship has no future. I'll do it, he said sadly. The expression on his face told me that maybe I'd pushed him too far. But he'd agreed to it, so whatever. You're a great guy. Baby, I just want to share you with my friends for one night, I said. You're handsome, you've got a great job, a great car, and my friends will love you, I assured him. So, 2 nights later, Tim dressed in a pair of dress pants and a jacket and waited for me on the couch in our living room. It used to be his living room, but we both live there now. It of course took me longer to get ready than it did for him to wash his Camaro, shower, and get dressed. This was mainly because I was pulling out all of the stops this time. I wanted everyone to see me with my sweetie, but I wanted them to know that I was a beautiful, desirable woman. In short, for one night I wanted them to see me the way he did. When we got to Rochelle's house, the Camaro's V8 growl announced our presence in a way that said, "Look at me, god damn it, I'm here." As we got out of the car, all eyes were on us. First, they looked at me. My dress was tight enough to show the curvature of my big hips without being overly tight, and it was low cut enough that my tits were on the verge of dropping into someone's lap if I leaned too far forward. But the thing that drew the most attention was my man. They'd all heard the stories of shy, reclusive Tim, but most of them didn't believe he existed. And the few that did think that there had to be something wrong with him for him to be with me. Most of them thought I was a trifle big, and the ones that realized that I was just voluptuous thought I was a hooker. When Tim came around and took my hand, the evening was sealed. Hell, my life was sealed, and I'd be water cooler gossip forever. Rochelle dragged her emaciated, but over to greet us almost as soon as we parked on her lawn. Her husband, I'd heard him described as a hot older guy, was with her. He was definitely older, but the hot part, not so much. He was a little too Grandpa Munster for me. He took my hand and welcomed me to their home. Their house was huge. It was like a European castle dropped into the suburbs. After Tim and I made the rounds, which meant I dragged him around to make sure every single living organism at the party, including the pets, saw us together, he quickly retreated into the shadows in a corner. Damn him. I wanted him to be more outgoing for just one night. I had to give serious consideration to what my future would be like with him. Now that most of the guys there had seen me with him, and Tim was kind of hot, maybe I could upgrade. Several of the women present had tried to make a run at him, and he quickly rebuffed their attentions. During the evening, I'd noticed that whenever my glass was empty, Rochelle's husband was there in a second to refill it. By the time he offered to give me a tour of their house and the grounds, I was feeling no pain. As soon as we got upstairs away from the crowd, I noticed his hand on my hips, and it was no accident. "I've heard a lot about you," he breathed into my ear. "Like what?" I asked. If it hadn't been for all of the liquor, I'd have moved his hand a long time ago, but the combination of liquor and frustration was amazing. Like, maybe you'd be better with an older lion as opposed to a younger mouse. He leaned in and kissed me. It felt really good to have someone go after what they wanted. He didn't wait. He didn't ask, he just saw what he wanted and took it. My failure to stop him only led to him becoming even bolder. The next thing I remembered, he had me in a room upstairs on my back, making out like we were teenagers. We only stopped when someone opened the door and looked in, looking for the bathroom. "Hey Kathy, your honey was looking for you." That tore it for me right then. Tim couldn't even hold a conversation with a few people that were important to me for a few minutes. I locked the door and noticed that I felt kind of woozy as I stepped back towards the bed. I looked at the clock next to the bed. Had I really been away from the party for nearly an hour? The clock must be wrong, I wasn't that drunk. As I stretched out on the bed, I noticed that Ron was already naked. "Pretty sure of yourself, aren't you?" I asked. "Nope, just pretty sure of you," he smirked. I wonder what he meant by that, but I didn't have time or the inclination to figure it out. Old Ron started having sex with me. It was such a change from having to always be the aggressive one when it came to sex. After I got started, old Ron didn't last too long. "Hey," I said. "Shut up, fat blob." "What?" I asked in surprise. "What did you say?" Ron just got off the bed and roughly tore at my dress, ripping it in the process. I stood before him almost naked in my prettiest lingerie. I had intended to put on a little show for him after the party, but it seemed like someone else would get the benefit of it now. "Dance for me, baby," he slurred, lying back on the bed. "Let me watch you move those big water-filled melons and shake that fat butt." I guess this was his way of talking sexy, but it was really insulting. And something else I noticed, Tim usually spent a lot of time cuddling me and making me feel good. He made me feel like I was beautiful and special. I suddenly realized that Tim's reticence wasn't because he was timid. When we were alone, he was far from it. Tim waited for permission because he loved me and respected me. Tim also wanted both of us to enjoy it when we were together. Right now, it seemed that this was all about Ron. The way he had me feeling right now was as if I was just some hooker he'd picked up. But because I was drunk, and because it was so different, I decided to go with it for a while longer. I had been dancing for a couple of minutes and saw Ron smiling. I couldn't tell if he was enjoying it or laughing at me because I'm not much of a dancer. Ron jumped off the bed and threw me down on it. He rolled me over and just started having sex with me again. It hurt like hell. I was about to protest, but he shot back. "Shut up and like it, Tubby." "What?" I asked again. This was so bad it was almost assault. The only thing good about it was that it was over quickly. He grunted a couple of times and then rolled over trying to catch his breath. I just laid there trying to figure out what I was going to do. I couldn't scream assault because I'd willingly come up here with him, and more importantly, I didn't want him to know about this at all. Plus, there was the problem of Rochelle. If she found out about this and didn't believe me, she could make my job a living hell for me or even get me fired. So, I just lay there and finally fell asleep. The next thought I had was that there was someone talking. When I opened my eyes, I noticed that it was light again. That meant it was morning and I'd been here all night. Where was Tim? How would I explain this? I heard the voices again. "What did you say her name was again?" asked Ron in a loud whisper. "It's Kathy, you doofus. Now go get her out of here," replied Rochelle. "Well, you invited her. Why can't you get rid of her?" whined Ron. "You screwed her and left her here, so it's your problem," snapped Rochelle. "It's only my problem because her little boyfriend turned you down," said Ron. "I guess that aging body and those sagging tits, what little there is of them, have lost their charm. If he was here, he'd be my problem. So she's yours," snapped Rochelle. "But she works for you. Why can't you do it?" asked Ron in a quiet voice. "You didn't seem to have any problem talking to her last night," said Rochelle. "Oh, you know how it is every once in a while. You want a big one," she continued. "She wasn't even good though," whined Ron. "If I had paid anything, I'd want my money back." "Hey, her eyes are open. Go ahead," said Rochelle. At that point, Ron came over to the bed and I noticed that the daylight didn't do much for him. He definitely looked much worse in the morning. "Hey, Bonnie," he said, smiling. "Kathy," I said. "Whatever. I called you a cab. Shouldn't you get dressed?" he asked. "Where's Tim?" I asked. "Oh, your honey boy. He left last night," said Ron in a frustrated tone. "Took one look at you sprawled out there and just ran out," he continued. "Several of the ladies at the party offered to go home with him, but no soap," he said. "Rochelle knows you had sex with me?" I asked. "Of course, we have an open marriage. That's the point of these parties, to try out different people and different things. They add a little fire to our relationship," he said proudly. "Actually, we hate each other so much, we couldn't even think about having sex," he said. "The only reason we don't get a divorce is because we'd be worse off alone," he said. A pretty messed up relationship, that's why it's open, he said. Well, I'm pretty sure it's messed up mine. It's going to take a lot to get him to forgive this. I don't think he will, said Ron. He seems like the true blue type, Ron said. You know, like he was madly in love with you. Like you were, he laughed, his dream girl or something. I'm sure seeing you laying there with your legs all open just broke his poor little heart. He laughed again. I turned around and looked at him. Why would you let him come in here? I asked. I didn't, Rochelle did. He turned her down flat, and she really wanted him. A lot of the women at the party did, but he wasn't having it. He said he loved you, and he's going to marry you. He laughed again. So Rochelle brought him up here to show him that you had no problem doing it, so he should too, said Ron. She can be a really vindictive bitch when she wants something, he laughed. So the two of you just screwed up my life for the fun of it? I hissed. Hey, you're a big girl, a very big girl. You knew why we came up here, he replied. I got what was left of my clothes and put them on, and of course my dress was ruined and would no longer close. I found my cell phone in my purse. I called Tim because I didn't want him to see me like this. It would only make things worse. I was hoping that he'd gone to work, so I could slip into our place and fix myself up. Then I'd call him and be waiting for the confrontation when he got home. This would be our first major fight, but I was sure if I promised him it would never, ever happen again. Maybe in time we'd get past this. Tim didn't pick up. In fact, my call went straight to voicemail as if his phone was turned off. Tim never turned his phone off. He always answered my call on the first ring. He was obviously angry. The cab arrived and the driver blew his horn. I spotted Rochelle on my way out. I don't know what made me do it, but seeing that skinny woman standing there smirking at me caused me to have a temporary loss of brain function. So, as I passed her, I just took a swing at her and knocked her flat on her butt. I got into the cab holding my dress together, and with as much dignity as I could muster gave the driver my address. He must have been trying for a big tip because he didn't say a single word to me. He just drove. When I got to our building, though everything seemed normal, I felt a sense of dread. I looked around and didn't see Tim's Camaro in our parking spot, so he wasn't here. That was a good thing, I thought. As I got to our floor, I saw that someone was moving in or moving out. There were a lot of suitcases lining the halls. They looked like our luggage, but then most suitcases really do look the same. I got my keys from my purse. Rochelle and her husband hadn't heard the last of this, but first I had to straighten out my life. For some strange reason, I couldn't get my key in the lock. Maybe I was still slightly drunk. I concentrated and it just didn't fit. I stomped all the way down to the first floor, to the building manager. Mr. Coletti was home luckily. I knocked on his door, and the music stopped and the door opened a crack. Mr. Coletti, there's something wrong with my key. I can't get in, I said. He didn't even open his door all the way, which was unusual. He was one of the most open-friendliest people we knew. There's nothing wrong with your key, miss, he said. Miss? I wondered. When did I become miss? Then why won't it fit in the lock? I asked in my most polite tone. Because the locks were changed at the request of the tenant of record, he said. And in the middle of the night, I might add. I couldn't think. I started crying, and when he saw this, Mr. Coletti just shook his head and closed his door. I called Tim again and left a message for him. I told him how sorry I was and how he didn't understand what had happened. I told him that I loved only him and that I'd do anything to make it up to him. Then with no one else to turn to, I called my mom. Before she got there, I went back up to the hall outside the apartment and changed into some other clothes. She drove me back to her house without saying a word. As we got in, I guess the silence was too much for her. What did you do? She asked. What? A guy you barely know locks me, your own daughter, out of our apartment, and all you want to know is what did I do? I snapped. Kathy, your dad and I aren't stupid. We know about the life you used to lead. And even though we only met him once, we really thought that Tim was the guy for you. He loves you so much, and after he called us 2 days ago, we just assumed. He called you? I asked. Yep, 3 times, she said. The first call he just hung up. I guess he didn't remember that with caller ID we knew who he was. But then he called back, and it was the cutest thing I'd ever seen. So old-fashioned too, she said. What was? I asked. Well, he said that he was going to do something for you, Kathy. Something that he really was afraid to do. Felt really uncomfortable with, but you really wanted it, and you'd promised to do anything he wanted in exchange. We were thinking, oh my God, he's going to make her do something really kinky. But he was calling to ask your dad's permission to ask you to marry him. Can you believe that? Nobody does that anymore. When she said that, I felt the tears well up, and my chest got tight. The third time he called, he wanted to show me the ring he'd gotten for you, so I could tell him whether or not you'd like it. You'd have to be crazy not to. What did you think when you first saw it? She asked. Then I started crying, and my mom asked me again, what did you do? Kathy, please tell me you didn't turn him down. Kathy, I'm your mother, and I love you, but you're not getting any younger. You're cute as hell, but you may never get another offer this good. He's a really nice young man. He's handsome. He's got a good job, and he obviously loves you. That boy really thinks you're something special. Why wouldn't you marry him? She demanded. My mom's mouth dropped open as if she'd just realized something. That's why you've never brought any boys home to meet us. She stuck her hand over her mouth and looked at me and then said, You're a lesbian. No, Mom, I'm not a lesbian. I'm a 304, I answered. Then why haven't you brought any guys home? 304s get lots of guys, she replied. Mom, they don't want a relationship with me. They just want to screw me and flee me. Tim was the first one that wanted to stick around, I said. Then why didn't you want to marry him? She shot back. Mom, it's a long story. Right now I just want to sleep. I called in and told my boss that I wouldn't be in for a couple of days. I thought I heard laughter in the background as I hung up. Then I called Tim and left another message for him to please call me. I tried calling his job, but the lady who answered the phone asked who I was, and after a moment asked me to leave a message. When I asked her if he was at work, she said that company policy forbid the release of any information about their employees. But just yesterday you told me exactly which restaurant he was having lunch at and gave me directions, I said. It's a new policy, she said. Then she told me to have a nice day, bitch, and hung up. I called Tim again and left yet another message. Then I tried to go to sleep, but I just couldn't get comfortable. I wasn't used to this bed, and I wasn't used to sleeping without him. I couldn't believe how much I missed him wrapping his arms around me. Finally, I drifted off to sleep, but it didn't last long. I dreamed about Rochelle screwing Tim. Then I heard my cell phone ring and woke up. I tried to get to the phone before it stopped ringing, but I couldn't find it in time. I dropped the phone on the bed, and it started ringing again. Hello, Tim, I said into the phone breathlessly. Nope, it's Tina, said the voice. Tina was one of the women I worked with. She was more of an acquaintance than a friend, so I was wondering why she'd be calling me. What do you want, Tina? I snapped. How are you feeling, Kathy? She asked. There were crickets chirping in the silence, so she spoke up again. Well, Kathy, seeing as how you've probably broken up with that Tim guy, I was wondering if you'd be interested in making a trade? What are you talking about? I snapped. Well, a girl like you can't be too choosy, so I was thinking I'll give you my brother's phone number, and you give me Tim's? I hung up the phone. Tina's brother Matt was married and had 3 kids, 2 of them with his wife, another with one of their teenage neighbors, and regularly beat the shit out of both women. Did everyone know about last night? I called Tim and left another message. This made the 10th one I'd left. I wondered whether he was listening to them and just didn't want to call me back, or if he just hadn't gotten the messages yet. I called the number for his voicemail service and entered his security PIN number. I listened to all of his messages. Most of them were from me, but there were 3 that got my attention. One was a message from the jeweler's store that told him that he couldn't return the ring because it had been inscribed, but maybe they could cover the inscription or change it if he found someone new. The next was from one of those skanks he worked with telling him she'd seen him in his office, and she thought he looked like he needed cheering up, so she was asking him out to lunch or dinner, his choice. The bitch even told him that if he chose dinner, he could upgrade to the deluxe package that included breakfast at her place for no extra charge. I should walk over there and beat the crap out of that bitch, I thought. But it was the last message that really hurt me. It was from his mother, and she told him that she loved him, and she hoped he'd feel better soon. She told him that she understood what he had lost, but sometimes the best way to get over a bad situation was to start again. Then she told him about some floozy he used to go out with who'd been back from college for a couple of years, and that maybe he should give her a call when he felt ready. It seemed like the whole world was ready to write me off, but I was determined to put this behind us and get him back. I guess this is where I should start putting together my nefarious plan to get back at Ron and Rochelle for what they did to my relationship, but there was nothing I could do. Ron didn't want me because he really liked skinny women like Rochelle. Rochelle didn't care that Ron screwed me because she knew that every once in a while, he just wanted to stick it to a big girl for a change of pace. I didn't ever want to see Ron again, and sex with him was revolting. It just made me miss Tim more. I called Tim thousands of times until one day he just changed his number and I couldn't get the new one. I tried waiting by the apartment, but he'd pull away every time he saw me, and they wouldn't let me inside the building. I couldn't get in the building he worked in either. Then one day it happened. I saw the Camaro pull up and Tim got out. He'd gotten his hair cut, and he looked great. He hadn't seen me yet, and he walked around to the passenger side. He reached in and a girl got out of the car. He took her hand and crushed my heart all in the same movement. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. She had long cornflower hair, big open blue eyes, and a smattering of freckles around her nose. But the thing that hurt the most was the way she looked at him. She looked at him the way he used to look at me, and he gave her that look right back. I knew then that it was over between Tim and me. There was no way I'd ever get him back. That was 3 years ago, and I still think about him now. I have a full life, though. I go to work, still at the same restaurant chain. I got a bit depressed over Tim for a while, and did pick up a bit of weight. So, I'm no longer a hostess, but I'm the best damn dishwasher they have. Outside of work, I put in a lot of time posting ads on Craigslist. I know that there's another Tim out there somewhere. I just have to find him. I also moved into an apartment right down the street from Tim's place. It's not too close because I don't want to be accused of stalking them or anything. Besides, with my telescope, I can see right in their windows. It's almost like I was there with them. I'm just waiting for that bitch to make a mistake, and she will because she's only human. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Welcome to another story on Cheating Tales Lab. We're so happy to have you here, and today's story is one we think you'll really enjoy. So without further ado, let's begin. Zephyr Blackwood's keys jangled as he fumbled with the lock. A bouquet of blue orchids cradled in one arm and a small velvet box tucked securely in his pocket. The house was unnaturally quiet as he stepped inside, the silence pressing against his ears like a physical force. "Lyra," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. No answer. Something was off. Zephyr's eyes darted around, taking in the subtle signs of disturbance. A photo frame lay face down on the side table, its usual place marred by its absence. As he moved further into the house, the wrongness intensified. In the kitchen, Lyra's favorite mug lay shattered on the floor, its pieces scattered like fallen stars. Her purse sat abandoned on the counter, its contents undisturbed. The orchids suddenly felt heavy in his hands, their delicate petals a mockery of the celebration he'd anticipated. Zephyr's heart raced as he made his way to the living room. Lyra's phone rested on the coffee table, its screen a web of cracks. He picked it up gingerly, as if it might bite him. The cracks spread outward from the center, like the tendrils of a sinister conspiracy reaching into his life. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his own phone and dialed Iris Zhao's number. Lyra's best friend picked up on the third ring, her voice pitched oddly high. "Hello? Zephyr? Iris, have you seen Lyra? She's not home, and things look strange." There was a pause, too long to be natural. "And no, I haven't seen her. Is everything okay?" Zephyr's suspicion grew with each stuttered word. Iris was hiding something, her usual poise crumbling under the weight of whatever secret she was keeping. "Are you sure? You haven't heard from her at all?" "I'm sorry, Zephyr. I really don't know where she is." The words tumbled out too quickly, each one another brick in the wall of deception. After hanging up, Zephyr found himself in their bedroom, drawn there by some instinct he couldn't name. His eyes fell on Lyra's jewelry box, an ornate wooden thing they bought on their honeymoon. Something niggled at the back of his mind. He opened it, fingers tracing the familiar contours. Then he paused. Was that a seam where there shouldn't be one? Pressing gently, he felt a click, and a false bottom sprang open. Inside lay a burner phone, its cheap plastic a stark contrast to Lyra's elegant jewelry. Zephyr's hand shook as he turned it on. The messages that filled the screen were in a code he didn't recognize, a fact that chilled him to the bone. He was a top cryptographer, for God's sake. If he couldn't crack it at a glance. The shrill ring of his phone cut through his thoughts like a knife. Detective Nolan Frost's gruff voice filled his ear before he could even say hello. "Mr. Blackwood, we found your wife barely alive in a motel. You need to come now." The words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the dresser. "What happened? Is she—" "Just get here," Frost interrupted, his tone grim. "There's more to this than meets the eye." As Zephyr rushed out the door, the velvet box fell from his pocket forgotten. The sapphire necklace inside glinted in the fading light, a testament to the love he thought he knew. The Starlight Motel loomed before Zephyr, its neon sign flickering weakly in the twilight. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and gasoline, a pungent cocktail that made his stomach churn. Police cars formed a barrier around the scene, their lights painting the world in alternating flashes of red and blue. An ambulance stood nearby, its back doors open like the maw of some patient beast. And there, wrapped around a lamppost like some grotesque modern art installation, was a mangled red Porsche. Detective Frost materialized out of the chaos, his weathered face a mask of grim determination. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, nodding in greeting. "Your wife was in an accident with Caspian Vex, her ex from college. He was driving under the influence." Zephyr's mind reeled. Caspian Vex? Lyra had never mentioned him. Frost's next words hit even harder. "But there's more to this than meets the eye, Mr. Blackwood." Before Zephyr could press for details, movement caught his eye. Paramedics were wheeling out a stretcher, and on it lay Lyra. Her face was pale, marred by ugly bruises that stood out like accusatory fingers pointing at some unseen culprit. Their eyes met across the chaos of the crime scene. Lyra reached out weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Honey, I'm so sorry. It was an accident." The words seemed to carry a weight beyond their simple meaning, laden with secrets and lies. Zephyr turned away, unable to bear the sight of her. His gaze fell on a briefcase among the scattered debris, its contents spilling out onto the asphalt. He caught glimpses of what looked like classified documents before a uniformed officer hurried to gather them up. As he made his way back to his car, a hushed conversation between two paramedics reached his ears. "Did you see those badges? High-level clearance, man." "Yeah, and those encrypted hard drives? What the hell were they doing here?" Zephyr's mind whirled, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to take shape. What had Lyra gotten herself into? And more importantly, what had she dragged him into along with her? The sterile corridors of the National Cyber Defense Agency headquarters seemed colder than usual as Zephyr made his way to his office. The events of the past few hours had left him feeling like a stranger in his own life. With practiced ease, he bypassed the standard security protocols and accessed the agency's personnel files. His fingers flew over the keyboard, searching for a name he'd never thought he'd need to know. Caspian Vex. There it was, hired 3 months ago as a cybersecurity consultant. Zephyr's eyes narrowed. It was a vague title, the kind used when someone needed access but didn't want to draw attention. Red flags unfurled in his mind, each one a warning he'd failed to heed. Burning the midnight oil? Zephyr nearly jumped out of his skin. Raven Coe stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the classified files on his screen. "Raven, He hesitated, weighing his options. Then, making a decision, he gestured for her to come in. "I need your help, but this stays between us." In a secure room, away from prying eyes and ears, Zephyr laid out the situation. Raven listened, her brilliant mind already connecting dots he hadn't even seen. "We need to look at the access logs," she said, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. "If what you're saying is true, there should be a pattern." Hours passed in a blur of code and caffeine. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, they had their answer. A series of minor but strategic security breaches over the past 6 months, all traced back to Zephyr's credentials. But the timestamps. "I wasn't even in the building for some of these," Zephyr muttered. Raven's voice was grim. "Someone's been using your access, and doing a damn good job of covering their tracks." They dug deeper, following digital breadcrumbs through the labyrinth of the agency's systems. And then they found it. Fragmented connections between Caspian Vex and chatter about a group known as the Cypher Syndicate on the dark web. "I've heard whispers about them," Raven said, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "They're planning something big, a cyber attack that could cripple entire nations." The implications hit Zephyr like a physical blow. Lyra had been using their marriage as a cover, feeding classified information to the Cypher Syndicate through Caspian. But why? What could possibly drive her to betray not just him, but their entire nation? With trembling hands, he pulled out the burner phone he'd found in Lyra's jewelry box. The encrypted messages that had baffled him earlier now seemed to mock him with their secrets. "Can you break this?" he asked Raven, handing her the phone. Her eyes lit up with the challenge. "Give me an hour." 53 minutes later, Raven's triumphant cry broke the tense silence. "I'm in." Zephyr leaned over her shoulder, his heart pounding. As the decrypted messages filled the screen, he felt the last remnants of his world crumble around him. Lyra wasn't just having an affair or stealing information. She was a deep-cover operative for the Cypher Syndicate, planted years ago to infiltrate the agency through him. Their entire relationship, their marriage, their life together, it had all been a lie. As the weight of the betrayal crashed over him, Zephyr gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. He'd thought he was living a love story. Instead, he'd been an unwitting pawn in a game of international espionage. And now, it was time to change the rules. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor assaulted Zephyr's nostrils as he made his way to Lyra's room. A manila envelope containing divorce papers was tucked under his arm, its weight a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered his world. Room 307. Zephyr paused at the door, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He pushed it open, the hinges squeaking softly as if protesting the intrusion. The sterile whiteness of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the warmth their home once held. Lyra lay in the bed, looking small and vulnerable in her hospital gown. Her eyes widened as she saw him, a mix of emotions flashing across her face. Relief, fear, and something else Zephyr couldn't quite place. "Zephyr," she began, her voice cracking. "I can explain." He cut her off with a raised hand, his face an impassive mask. Without a word, he placed a manila envelope on her bedside table. The soft thud it made seemed to echo in the silence of the room. Lyra's eyes darted to the envelope, then back to Zephyr. Understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by panic. "Please, just let me." The door opened again, cutting off her plea. Caspian Vex sauntered in, his arm in a sling and a nasty gash running across his forehead. The smug grin on his face faltered slightly as he registered Zephyr's presence. "Well, well," Caspian drawled, recovering quickly. "If it isn't the man of the hour." Zephyr's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Caspian's next words hit like a sledgehammer. "I suppose introductions are in order. Zephyr Blackwood. Meet Lyra's handler in the Cypher Syndicate." "Oh, wait, that's me." Lyra's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Zephyr's mind raced, processing this new information. He'd suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed so brazenly. "What do you want?" Zephyr managed to grit out, his voice low and dangerous. Caspian's smirk widened. "Straight to business. I like that." He lowered himself into a chair, wincing slightly as the movement jostled his injured arm. "We want your cooperation, Zephyr. Your expertise, your access. In return, we don't expose certain indiscretions from your past." Zephyr's blood ran cold. How could they possibly know about? "That's right," Caspian continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Lyra here discovered a rather interesting ethical breach from your early days at the agency. Wouldn't want that getting out, would we?" Zephyr's face remained impassive, but his mind was working overtime. He needed time, needed to think. I need some time to consider this," he said, allowing a hint of vulnerability to creep into his voice. Caspian nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Take all the time you need. We'll be in touch." As Zephyr turned to leave, his hand brushed against the get-well card in his pocket. In one smooth motion, he placed it on Lyra's bedside table, right next to the divorce papers. The high-tech listening device hidden within would pick up every word spoken in this room. With a final, inscrutable look at Lyra, Zephyr walked out, the first step of his counter-strategy set in motion. The game was on, and he intended to win. Artemis Steele's office was a fortress within a fortress. Zephyr had been here countless times before, but never like this. Never with the weight of betrayal and conspiracy hanging over his head. Director Steele herself was a formidable presence, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce right through him as he laid out everything he'd uncovered. The burner phone, the security breaches, the cipher syndicate, Lyra's true identity. He held nothing back. As he finished his report, Steele leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Finally, she spoke. This goes deeper than we ever imagined. Her eyes narrowed as she absorbed the information. We need to turn this to our advantage. Zephyr nodded, relieved that she believed him. What do you suggest, Director? A slow, predatory smile spread across Steele's face. We make you a double agent, Mr. Blackwood. Feed false information to Lyra and Caspian. Use them to unravel the entire Cipher Syndicate operation from the inside out. The plan was daring, dangerous, and exactly what Zephyr had hoped for. I'm in, he said without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, Zephyr lived a precarious double life. To Lyra and Caspian, he appeared to be a reluctant accomplice, sharing carefully selected tidbits of classified information. Each piece of data was meticulously crafted misinformation, designed to mislead the Cipher Syndicate while appearing valuable on the surface. Lyra, now out of the hospital, watched him with a mix of suspicion and hope. Zephyr played his part to perfection, allowing just enough reluctance and resentment to show through to make his cooperation believable. Caspian, for his part, seemed to revel in his perceived victory. His smug grins and condescending pats on the back made Zephyr's skin crawl, but he endured it all for the sake of the mission. One night, as Zephyr sat in his darkened living room, monitoring the feed from the listening device he'd planted in Lyra's hospital room, he overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Everything's going according to plan. Lyra's voice came through, tinny but clear. Zephyr's cooperating, just like you said he would. Good, a gruff male voice replied. Zephyr's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. Detective Nolan Frost. Keep him in line. We can't afford any slip-ups this close to the endgame. Zephyr's mind reeled. Detective Frost, the man in charge of investigating the motel incident, was on the Cipher Syndicate's payroll. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had ever imagined. As the days wore on, the toll of his deception began to show. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His movements became jittery and unpredictable. Raven, ever observant, couldn't help but notice. Zephyr, she said one day, cornering him in a secure room at the NCDA. What's going on with you? And don't tell me it's nothing. I know you better than that. For a moment, Zephyr considered brushing her off, but the concern in her eyes, the genuine worry in her voice, broke through his defenses. In a moment of vulnerability, he found himself confiding in her about the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. I feel like I'm losing myself, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Every lie, every piece of false information I feed them, it's like I'm chipping away at who I am. Raven listened silently, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of his emotions. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. You're not losing yourself, she said firmly. You're fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. That's who you are, Zephyr. Don't ever forget that. Her words, simple yet powerful, gave Zephyr the strength to continue. As he navigated this treacherous path, Raven's support became his lifeline, a reminder of why he was fighting in the first place. The abandoned subway station loomed before Zephyr, its entrance a gaping maw in the side of a decrepit building. Graffiti covered every available surface, and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay and neglect. Zephyr adjusted his glasses, ensuring the hidden camera was in place. The live stream to the secure NCDA server was already running, capturing every detail of this clandestine meeting with the Cipher Syndicate leaders. As he descended into the bowels of the station, the dank atmosphere closed in around him. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the sound of dripping water echoed ominously in the distance. The syndicate members were already gathered, their faces partially obscured by the poor lighting. Zephyr recognized Caspian and Lyra among them, along with a few others he'd seen in surveillance photos. As the meeting progressed, Zephyr's blood ran cold. The syndicate's ultimate plan was far more ambitious and devastating than anyone had anticipated. They intended to crash the global financial market using stolen algorithms, creating worldwide economic chaos on an unprecedented scale. Zephyr kept his face impassive as he absorbed this information, but inside, his mind was racing. The implications were staggering. Millions of lives would be affected, entire nations brought to their knees. He knew then that the stakes of his mission had just been raised exponentially. In the days that followed, Lyra made several attempts to rekindle their relationship. Her touches, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt like poison on Zephyr's skin. Her words of love and regret rang hollow in his ears. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered one night, her hand on his arm. "You have to believe me, Zephyr. Everything I've done, it was for a greater cause." Zephyr played along, forcing himself to respond with just the right mix of hesitation and lingering affection. All the while, he documented every interaction, building a case that would eventually bring the entire syndicate crashing down. Caspian, meanwhile, grew increasingly paranoid. Zephyr often caught him watching with narrowed eyes, as if trying to peer into his very thoughts. "I want round-the-clock surveillance on Blackwood," Caspian barked at one of his underlings. "If he so much as sneezes, I want to know about it." This new level of scrutiny complicated Zephyr's covert activities. Communication with Director Steele and Raven became a dangerous game of cat and mouse. He found himself employing ever more creative methods to pass along crucial information without detection. Late one night, as Zephyr was in the middle of transmitting a particularly sensitive piece of intel to Director Steele, disaster nearly struck. The door to his office began to open, the handle turning agonizingly slowly. Zephyr's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to hide the evidence of his true allegiance. Just as the door swung open, revealing one of Caspian's men, Raven's voice came through on the intercom. "Zephyr, I need you in the lab right away. We've got a situation with the firewall." The syndicate member hesitated, then grudgingly allowed Zephyr to leave. As he hurried down the corridor, Zephyr sent a silent thank you to Raven for her perfectly timed intervention. Later, as he pored over some of the syndicate's encrypted communications, Zephyr made a chilling discovery. Hidden within the complex codes and ciphers was evidence suggesting that the Cipher Syndicate had infiltrated the highest levels of government. But it was the next revelation that truly shook him to his core. As he dug deeper, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs, he uncovered something that made his blood run cold. The evidence pointed to a mole within the upper echelons of the NCDA itself. Zephyr sat back in his chair, his mind reeling from the implications. The enemy wasn't just out there. It was here, within the very walls he'd sworn to protect. As he stared at the damning evidence on his screen, one thought echoed through his mind. Who could he trust now? The air in the NCDA's secure conference room crackled with tension. Zephyr Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his eyes hard as flint as he surveyed the small group of trusted operatives before him. Director Artemis Steele sat to his right, her face an impassive mask that betrayed nothing of the high-stakes game they were about to play. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zephyr began, his voice low and steady, "what I'm about to propose is not only dangerous but technically illegal. If anyone wants to leave now, there will be no repercussions." No one moved. Zephyr nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Let's begin." Over the next hour, Zephyr laid out the bones of an elaborate sting operation. The centerpiece? A fictitious quantum encryption server that would supposedly house the world's most sensitive financial data. "We're going to create a honeypot so sweet the Cipher Syndicate won't be able to resist," Zephyr explained, his fingers dancing across a holographic display as he spoke. "This server will be our bait, our trap, and our key to bringing down the entire operation." Director Steele leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she absorbed the details. "And how do you propose we leak this information without arousing suspicion?" Zephyr's smile was cold. Through me. I'll feed the information to Lyra and Caspian, bit by tantalizing bit. They think they have me under their thumb. It's time we use that to our advantage. As the meeting progressed, the plan took shape. Carefully controlled leaks, strategically placed vulnerabilities, all designed to draw the Cypher Syndicate into a trap of the NCDA's making. Over the next few weeks, Zephyr became a master of misdirection. Every conversation with Lyra, every clandestine meeting with Caspian, became an opportunity to drop hints about the quantum encryption server. I overheard something interesting today, Zephyr would say, his voice carefully modulated to sound both nervous and excited. A new server, supposed to be unhackable. It's got everyone at the agency on edge. He watched as the bait was taken, hook, line, and sinker. The Cypher Syndicate mobilized their most skilled hackers, pouring resources into cracking what they believed to be the ultimate prize. Zephyr stood in the shadows of the NCDA's main server room, watching as technicians scurried about, setting up the elaborate ruse. Fake servers hummed, their blinking lights a testament to the agency's attention to detail. Everything had to be perfect. The slightest inconsistency could blow the entire operation. As he observed the controlled chaos, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Zephyr. He turned to see Lyra approaching, Caspian close behind. Their faces were masks of determination and barely concealed greed. "We need access to the server room," Lyra said, her voice low and urgent. "The quantum encryption server. You're going to get us in." Zephyr felt a chill run down his spine. This was it, the endgame. He nodded slowly, playing the part of the reluctant accomplice to perfection. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after this, we're done. I want out." Caspian's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Oh, Zephyr, you're in this for the long haul now. There's no getting out." As Zephyr led them towards the heart of the trap, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. Something was off. The Syndicate's movement seemed too precise, too well-informed. It was as if they knew exactly where to step to avoid the NCDA's carefully laid snares. A chilling realization struck him like a physical blow. There was a mole on his team. Someone privy to the details of the sting operation was feeding information to the Syndicate. As he punched in the access code to the server room, Zephyr's mind raced. The trap was sprung, but who was really caught in its jaws? He had mere moments to identify the traitor and salvage the operation before everything fell apart. The heavy door swung open with a soft hiss, revealing the blinking lights and humming servers within. As Lyra and Caspian stepped eagerly into the room, Zephyr's hand hovered over the concealed panic button in his pocket. One press, and the entire building would go into lockdown. But before he could act, a voice from behind froze him in his tracks. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Blackwood." Zephyr turned slowly, his blood running cold as he recognized the speaker. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place, revealing a picture far more twisted than he could have imagined. The server room, once a sanctuary of order and control, had become a battleground. Zephyr's mind raced, processing the unfolding chaos with the cold precision of the master cryptographer he was. The Syndicate's uncanny knowledge of their countermeasures suddenly made horrifying sense. Zephyr's eyes darted around the room, cataloging every face, every micro-expression. The mole was here, in this very room. But who? A bead of sweat trickled down his spine as he realized the magnitude of the situation. The entire operation was unraveling faster than he could patch the holes. He was going to have to improvise, relying on years of experience and the razor-sharp instincts honed through countless cyber battles. "Impressive setup, Zephyr." Caspian's voice dripped with smug satisfaction. "Almost had us fooled. Almost." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes cold and calculating. Gone was the vulnerability she'd shown in the hospital. This was the real Lyra, the deep-cover operative who had played him for years. "Did you really think we wouldn't see through your little charade?" she asked, her voice like silk over steel. Zephyr's retort died on his lips as a new figure entered the fray. Detective Nolan Frost sauntered into the server room, a predatory grin on his weathered face. "Surprised to see me, Blackwood?" Frost chuckled. "You should have dug a little deeper into that motel incident. Might have saved you some trouble." The trio converged on Zephyr, backing him against the humming servers. They thought they had won, their victory assured by treachery and deceit. But Zephyr Blackwood was far from beaten. "You're right," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I should have dug deeper. Into all of you." With a swift motion, Zephyr pulled out a small device from his pocket. The syndicate members tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, a holographic display flickered to life, filling the air with streams of data. "What you're seeing," Zephyr explained, his confidence growing with each word, "is every piece of intelligence I've gathered on the Cypher Syndicate over the past weeks. Every conversation, every transaction, every dirty little secret." Caspian's face drained of color. Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. Frost's hand inched towards his concealed weapon. "The real sting operation," Zephyr continued, "was layers deep. This server room, it's a sophisticated containment system. The moment you stepped inside, you activated a dormant protocol. We're locked in, and every word you say is being recorded and transmitted to law enforcement agencies worldwide." The realization of their predicament dawned on the syndicate members' faces. They had walked right into a trap far more intricate than they could have imagined. Lyra, ever the quick thinker, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Her face softened, tears welling up in her eyes. "Zephyr, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "What we had, it wasn't all a lie. I grew to love you. Truly. We can still have a life together. Just give me a chance to explain." For a moment, just a fleeting instant, Zephyr's resolve wavered. The memory of happier times, of a love he thought was real, threatened to overwhelm him. But then he remembered the betrayal, the years of lies, the lives put at risk for the Syndicate's twisted ambitions. His expression hardened. "No, Lyra," he said, his voice cold. "We can't." With a subtle hand motion, Zephyr activated the final phase of his countermove. Alarms blared throughout the building as armed NCDA agents began to swarm towards their location. Panic erupted in the server room. Caspian lunged for the door, only to find it sealed shut. Frost drew his weapon, his eyes darting wildly for an escape route. Lyra stood frozen, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. In the chaos, the three managed to slip past Zephyr, making a break for the emergency stairwell. They disappeared through the door, just as the first NCDA agents rounded the corner. Zephyr gave chase, his intimate knowledge of the building's layout guiding his pursuit. The hunt was on, and he was determined to see it through to the bitter end. Rain lashed against the windows of the NCDA headquarters as Zephyr tore through the labyrinthine corridors. His footsteps echoed off the sterile walls, mingling with the distant shouts of agents and the wail of alarms. He could hear them ahead, Lyra, Caspian, and Frost, their desperation palpable in the frantic pounding of their feet. But Zephyr had the home field advantage. He'd walked these halls countless times, knew every shortcut and hidden passage. As they approached a T-junction, Zephyr cut left, taking a maintenance corridor that would bring him out ahead of the fleeing trio. He burst through a door just as they rounded the corner, nearly colliding with Caspian. The look of shock on their faces was almost comical. Almost. "End of the line," Zephyr panted, blocking their path. Frost raised his weapon, but Lyra pushed his arm down. "No, there's still a way out." The roof. They turned and ran, leaving Zephyr to give chase once more. Up they went, flight after flight of stairs, the storm growing louder with each floor they climbed. Finally, they burst onto the roof. The rain came down in sheets, drenching them instantly. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark, electric blue. Lyra spun to face Zephyr, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wild. "Zephyr, please," she shouted over the howling wind. "You have to listen to me. I'm pregnant. It's yours." The words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. He faltered, his mind reeling. Could it be true? After everything, could there be an innocent life caught in the crossfire of their deception? Caspian seized the moment of distraction. Enough of this shit, he snarled, pulling out a small remote. With the press of a button, the whir of rotors cut through the storm. A helicopter rose into view, hovering at the edge of the roof. Their escape route. It's over, Zephyr, Frost called out, already moving towards a chopper. You lost. Accept it. But Zephyr wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As Lyra and Caspian made for the helicopter, Zephyr reached into his pocket and activated a device of his own. To anyone watching, it would have looked like he was simply letting them go. They didn't know that every word spoken in that helicopter would be broadcast to law enforcement agencies worldwide. Their escape vehicle had become a flying confession booth. Zephyr stood in the rain, watching as the helicopter lifted off into the stormy night. Water streamed down his face, indistinguishable from the tears he refused to acknowledge. A hand on his shoulder startled him. He turned to see Director Steele, her usually immaculate suit soaked through, her eyes glinting with a fierce pride. It's done, Zephyr said, his voice barely audible over the fading sound of rotors. They thought they could use me, betray me, and walk away. But they underestimated what I'm capable of. This is the price of their deceit. Steele nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Come on, she said gently. Let's get you inside. There's still work to be done. As they turned to leave the roof, Zephyr cast one last look at the storm-tossed sky. The helicopter was gone, swallowed by the night. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the echoes of betrayal would resound through the digital realm, changing the landscape of cybersecurity forever. With a deep breath, Zephyr squared his shoulders and followed Steele back into the building. The storm raged on, but within him, a calm had settled. He had faced his betrayers, confronted his past, and emerged stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The war against the Cypher Syndicate was far from over, but tonight, Zephyr Blackwood had struck a decisive blow, and he would not rest until the last echoes of their betrayal had been silenced. The federal courthouse loomed before Zephyr Blackwood, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold within. 2 months had passed since that rain-soaked confrontation on the NCDA rooftop, but the weight of those events still pressed heavily upon his shoulders. As he ascended the steps, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Zephyr kept his gaze forward, his face an impassive mask. He was the star witness in the trial against the Cypher Syndicate, and the world was watching. The courtroom fell silent as Zephyr took the stand. His eyes swept across the room, landing on Lyra and Caspian. They sat among the other arrested syndicate members, their prison jumpsuits a far cry from the polished personas they once projected. Lyra's gaze met his, a mixture of defiance and something else, regret perhaps? Caspian, on the other hand, glared with undisguised hatred. Over the next several days, Zephyr's testimony unfolded like a complex algorithm. He presented decrypted communications, detailed financial trails, and played the damning confessions recorded from the rigged helicopter. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the syndicate's coffin, exposing the full extent of their operations. The media dubbed it the trial of the century. Zephyr's dual role as victim and hero captivated the public imagination. Despite the intense pressure and scrutiny, he remained composed, his testimony clear and unwavering. During a recess, Zephyr found himself alone in a private chamber, his mind still racing from the morning's cross-examination. The door opened, and Lyra was escorted in by a guard. Her eyes, once so familiar, now seemed to belong to a stranger. Zephyr, she began, her voice soft. I know you probably won't believe me, but I need you to know. What I told you on the roof about being pregnant, it wasn't entirely a lie. I thought I was at the time. Zephyr's face remained impassive. I know the truth, Lyra. I saw your medical records from the hospital after the crash. You were never pregnant. The color drained from Lyra's face as she realized her final deception had been unraveled before it even began. Without another word, she was led away, leaving Zephyr alone with the echoes of her lies. When the verdict finally came down, it fell like a hammer blow. Caspian, identified as a key syndicate operative, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Lyra, despite her attempts to paint herself as a reluctant participant, received 25 years. The syndicate's leader, a shadowy figure finally unmasked, was given a life sentence. In the aftermath of the trial, as the dust began to settle, Zephyr found himself at a crossroads. An offer had been extended, the chance to lead a new international cybersecurity task force. It was an opportunity to be at the forefront of preventing future cyber threats, to turn his painful experience into a force for good. As he pondered the decision, Zephyr found himself standing before the NCDA's memorial wall. A new name had been added since he last visited Raven Coe, his friend and colleague. Fatally wounded while protecting him during the final confrontation with the syndicate, he placed a hand on her name, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "I'll make it count, Raven," he whispered. "I promise." Weeks later, Zephyr stood before the newly formed International Cyber Defense Coalition in Geneva. As he prepared to address the assembly and accept his new role, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The betrayal had nearly broken him, but it had also forged him into someone stronger, someone capable of protecting others from experiencing the same pain. Zephyr stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping across the gathered dignitaries and cybersecurity experts. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, the digital realm is our new front line. And on this front line, trust is both our greatest vulnerability and our strongest asset. Today, we start building a safer digital future, a future where betrayal cannot hide in the shadows of cyberspace." As his words resonated through the chamber, Zephyr felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He had transformed his personal tragedy into a powerful drive for global cybersecurity. The echoes of betrayal that had once threatened to destroy him had become the foundation of a new era of digital defense. In that moment, as he looked out over the faces of those who would join him in this fight, Zephyr Blackwood knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for the future of cyberspace lay ahead, and he was ready to lead the charge. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.